Blood dripped from the courthouse steps as they dragged out the third dead owner of Whispering Creek Ranch. 12 cents for 12 acres. That was the devil's bargain. Caleb Mercer just made his scarred hands signing papers while the whole town of Liberty watched in horror. You just bought your own grave, soldier, the auctioneer whispered. But Caleb had already survived Gettysburg's killing fields. What demon could Montana hold that was worse? Welcome to a story of betrayal, stolen land, and the price of justice. Comment below which city you're watching from. Let's see how far this tale of the American frontier reaches. Now let me tell you how one man's desperate purchase became a war against the most powerful men in Montana. The October wind carried death through Liberty, Montana, cutting between the wooden buildings like invisible knives. Caleb Mercer stood at the courthouse steps, his weathered Confederate coat doing little against the mountain cold. His dog Boone, a scarred Mastiff mix, who'd followed him since Virginia pressed against his leg, sensing the crowd's hostility. Going once for 12 cents. The auctioneer's voice cracked over the murmuring crowd. Thomas Whitmore's hammer hung in the air like an executioner's axe. Whispering Creek Ranch, 12 acres with cabin and water rights. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The crowd of nearly 200 souls stood frozen, their faces masks of fear and morbid fascination. Women clutched their children closer. Men who'd fought Indians and outlaws suddenly found the wooden planks beneath their feet fascinating. 12 cents, folks. Less than the price of a whiskey shot for prime Montana land. Caleb's gray eyes, aged beyond his 38 years, swept across the crowd. He recognized most faces: merchants, ranchers, even the banker Harold Fitzgerald, who denied him a loan just yesterday. They all knew why the land sold for pennies. They all knew about the bodies. I'll take it. His voice cut through the silence like a rifle shot. The crowd gasped collectively. Stepping back as if he'd announced he had the plague. Martha Henderson, the minister's wife, crossed herself. Old Jake Sullivan, who'd lost an arm to a Sioux arrow, shook his head slowly. Son? Whitmore lowered his hammer, his ruddy face going pale. You know what happened to the last 3 owners. I know they're dead. Caleb stepped forward, his limp from a Yankee musket ball barely noticeable. He reached into his coat, producing 12 copper pennies that clinked like funeral bells as he placed them on the auctioneer's podium. That makes the land available, doesn't it? Whitmore stared at the coins as if they might bite him. Caleb, listen to reason. Jim Morrison lasted 2 weeks before they found him hanging from his own barn rafters. The Hendricks boy didn't even make it 3 days torn apart by what looked like wolves, except wolves don't arrange a man's insides in patterns. And Sarah Chen, someone called from the crowd. That Chinese woman who bought it last spring. Found her in pieces, another voice added, scattered across all 12 acres like seeds. Took us 3 days to find enough to bury. Caleb's jaw tightened. Then she's not using the land anymore, is she? Sheriff Benjamin Cross pushed through the crowd, his star catching the pale autumn sun. At 53, Cross had seen enough violence to fill 3 lifetimes, but even he looked uneasy. Mercer. I know times have been hard since you came out here, but this ain't the answer. That land is cursed. Every Apache from here to Canada knows it. Hell, even the crow won't hunt there. Cursed. Caleb tested the word, found it wanting. Sheriff, I've seen 5,000 men die in a single afternoon at Gettysburg. I've walked through fields where the ground squished with blood for a quarter mile. I've heard dying men call for their mothers in 3 different languages. He picked up one of the pennies, holding it to the light. You want to talk to me about curses? This is different, Cross insisted. This is older than the war, older than what? Than hunger, than having nowhere to stable my horse for winter, than watching men like Fitzgerald there deny credit to anyone who wore gray. Caleb's voice remained steady, but Boone began to growl low, sensing his master's anger. I need land, Sheriff. This land is available. That's all that matters. Banker Fitzgerald. A soft man who'd spent the war selling supplies at triple markup stepped forward. His black suit was immaculate, his gold watch chain catching the light. Mr. Mercer, perhaps we could revisit your loan application. I'm sure we could find terms. Yesterday, my money wasn't good enough for you, Fitzgerald. Today it is. Caleb turned back to Whitmore. Make it official. The auctioneer's hand trembled as he raised the hammer. Whispering Creek Ranch 12 acres, including cabin barn and water rights sold to Caleb Mercer for 12 cents. May God have mercy on your soul. The hammer fell with a sound like a coffin lid closing. The crowd began to disperse immediately, nobody wanting to stand too close to a dead man walking. Caleb heard the whispers as they fled 3 days maximum. Fool's throwing his life away. Should we start digging his grave now or wait? Only Sheriff Cross remained, his weathered face creased with genuine concern. Caleb, I've got to ask why you're not a stupid man. You survived the war, made it all the way out here. Why throw it away for cursed land? Caleb bent down, running his scarred fingers through Boone's thick fur. The dog's tail wagged once, trusting his master's judgment absolutely. Sheriff, you ever been so tired that even dying seems like rest? That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got. Caleb stood adjusting his worn saddlebags. Besides, maybe the land just hasn't met the right owner yet. Cross studied him for a long moment. You know about the Apache burial ground, don't you? About what the railroad did? I know stories. Not stories, truth. Cross lowered his voice, glancing around nervously. 5 years back, before the railroad came through that land, was sacred to the Apache. They'd been burying their dead there for generations. Then Josiah Barrett, Colonel Barrett, as he likes to be called now, decided the railroad needed a new route. The Apache wouldn't sell, wouldn't move their dead. So Barrett moved them anyway. Worse. Cross's face darkened. He had his men dig up the graves, scattered the bones across the territory, used some of them for... He paused, swallowing hard. Decorations at his ranch. Said it would teach the savages a lesson about progress. The Apache chief Two Eagles cursed the land with his dying breath after Barrett's men finished with him. Caleb absorbed this information without expression. And you believe in curses, Sheriff. I believe in consequences, Mercer. And that land has seen more blood than soil. Cross placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder. It's not too late. We could say the sale was invalid, that you were drunk, or I haven't been drunk since Chancellorsville. Caleb shrugged off the sheriff's hand. The sale stands. As if to punctuate his words, a raven cawed from the courthouse roof. Then another. Within moments, a dozen of the black birds had gathered, their dark eyes fixed on Caleb with unnatural interest. They know, Martha Henderson whispered from the doorway of her husband's church. The ravens always know when death's coming. Caleb looked up at the birds, meeting their gaze without flinching. Then they're going to be disappointed. I don't die easy. He began walking toward the livery stable where his horse waited, Boone padding alongside him. The crowd parted like water, nobody wanting to touch him. As he passed the general store, old Samuel Richards called out from his doorway. Mercer, at least take some supplies, on credit. You'll need food ammunition. I pay my debts, Richards. Not a debt. Call it a gift for a dead man. Caleb paused, turning back. Richards was already loading a crate with canned goods ammunition and medical supplies. His daughter Emma, barely 17, added a bottle of whiskey and some dried meat. Papa, we shouldn't, she whispered, but loud enough for Caleb to hear. If he dies owing us, then we write it off as charity, Richards said firmly. He carried the crate to Caleb's horse himself, securing it to the saddle. There's enough here for 2 weeks, though I suppose you won't need that long. Your confidence is touching. Richards gripped Caleb's arm as he mounted his horse. Listen, Mercer. I fought with the 2nd Minnesota at Chickamauga. I've seen brave and I've seen stupid. What you're doing? He shook his head. There's a difference between facing death and courting it. Sometimes there isn't. Caleb touched the brim of his hat. Thank you for the supplies. As he rode out of Liberty, Caleb heard the church bell begin to toll. 13 times the traditional announcement of a death. They were already mourning him. The road to Whispering Creek wound through lodgepole pines and aspens, already turning gold with autumn. His horse, a sturdy mare named Delilah, he'd bought with his last mustering out pay, picked her way carefully along the rutted trail. Boone ranged ahead, occasionally stopping to sniff at something before circling back. After an hour's ride, the trees began to change. The aspens grew twisted, their white bark scarred with strange markings. The pines leaned away from the trail as if trying to escape. Even the light seemed different here, filtered through branches into patterns that hurt to look at directly. Boone stopped suddenly, hackles raised, growling at something in the brush. "Easy, boy." Caleb drew his Navy Colt, scanning the tree line. "What is it?" A figure emerged from the shadows, an ancient Apache woman, her face a map of wrinkles, her eyes milky with cataracts. She wore a traditional dress decorated with beads that clicked like bones as she moved. "You are the new owner," she said in accented English. It wasn't a question. "I am." She studied him for a long moment, her blind eyes somehow seeing more than they should. "You carry death with you, soldier, but not the kind we placed on that land." "You're saying you cursed it?" A bitter laugh escaped her. "We didn't need to. The land cursed itself when it drank our ancestors' blood. When Barrett's men scattered our bones, the earth itself grew angry." She stepped closer and Caleb caught the scent of sage and something older, earthier. "Turn back. You seem like a decent man." "Decent men don't always have choices." "Everyone has choices. You choose to die on cursed ground." "I choose to live on land I can afford." She shook her head slowly. The last woman, the Chinese one, she said the same. We found her fingers first arranged like a fan beside the creek, then her eyes placed carefully on flat stones like offerings. Whatever haunts that land, it takes its time. I appreciate the warning. It's not a warning. It's a prophecy. She turned to leave, then paused. "Your dog, he's loyal. That might save you for a day or two. Animals sense what men ignore. When he refuses to go further, you should listen." She disappeared back into the forest before Caleb could respond. Delilah snorted nervously, eager to move on. But Boone stood frozen, staring after the old woman, a low whine building in his throat. "Come on, boy, we've got property to inspect." They continued up the trail, the atmosphere growing heavier with each mile. The birds had gone silent, no jays, no woodpeckers, not even crows. The only sound was Delilah's hooves on stone and Boone's increasingly agitated panting. Then he saw it. The gate to Whispering Creek Ranch hung crooked on its hinges, the wood scarred with what looked like claw marks or desperate fingernails. Above it, strung between the posts like a grotesque banner, hung something that made Delilah rear back in terror. A body. But not just any body. This one was fresh, still dripping blood onto the dirt below. The man was Native American, his traditional war shirt soaked crimson eagle feathers broken and scattered beneath him. He'd been tied to the gate with barbed wire that cut deep into his flesh, and he was still breathing. Jesus Christ! Caleb dismounted quickly, pulling out his knife. "Hold on, I'm going to cut you down." The man's eyes fluttered open, intelligent eyes fierce despite the pain. "No! Time!" he gasped in perfect English. "They're coming back." Who did this? Barrett's men." Blood bubbled from his lips. "Looking for papers." Caleb sawed through the barbed wire, catching the man as he fell. Up close, he could see this was no ordinary Apache. The man's clothes beneath the blood were well made. His hands bore the calluses of a warrior, but also the ink stains of education. "What papers?" The dying man gripped Caleb's coat with surprising strength. "Proof of the murders. The land theft." He coughed, spraying blood. "My daughter, Raven Sky. They have her." "Where?" "Old mining camp, Devil's Hollow." His grip loosened. "Please, she's all that's left." "What's your name?" "Two Eagles, son of Walking Bear, chief of—" The light faded from his eyes before he could finish. Caleb closed the dead man's eyes, his mind racing. Two Eagles. The same Chief Cross had mentioned the one who'd supposedly cursed the land, but he'd been dead for years according to the stories. Unless the stories were wrong. Unless everything about Whispering Creek was a lie. Boone suddenly began barking furiously, facing back toward town. Caleb heard it, then horses. Multiple riders coming fast. He dragged Two Eagles' body behind the gatepost, covering it quickly with brush. No time for proper burial, but he wouldn't leave the man hanging like a warning. The riders burst through the trees. 5 men, all armed, led by a giant wearing a colonel's insignia despite having no official military bearing. Josiah Barrett himself, Caleb realized. The railroad enforcer who'd started all this. Barrett was everything whispered about him, and worse. 6.5 feet tall, built like a prizefighter, with hands that had clearly broken more than contracts. His face might have been handsome once, but cruelty had carved itself into every line. His pale blue eyes held the flat effect of a man who'd learned to enjoy causing pain. Well, well. Barrett's voice was cultured, Eastern educated, but with an undertone of violence. The new owner. We heard someone was finally stupid enough to buy this cursed shithole. It's my cursed shithole now, Caleb said evenly, hand resting on his Colt. Barrett laughed, his men joining in. For about 5 more minutes. You see, Mr. Mercer. Mr. Mercer. This land has certain complications. Previous owners didn't understand that. They thought owning meant something out here. He leaned forward in his saddle. It doesn't. Seems to mean something to you, or you wouldn't be here. Barrett's smile vanished. We're looking for someone, an Apache terrorist who's been stirring up trouble. Killed 3 of my men last week. Haven't seen any Apache. Technically true. 2 Eagles was behind the gate, not in sight. One of Barrett's men, a thin rattlesnake of a gunman with dead eyes, dismounted and started toward the gate. Boss, there's blood here. Fresh. Is there now? Barrett's eyes never left Caleb's. Mr. Mercer, you wouldn't be lying to me, would you? On your very first day as a landowner, I just got here myself. If there's blood, it's not my doing. The thin gunman pushed past the gate, then stopped. Boss, there's drag marks. Barrett dismounted slowly, his hand moving to the ivory-handled Colt at his hip. Mr. Mercer, I'm going to give you one chance to reconsider your position. We're looking for an Apache named 2 Eagles. He has certain documents that belong to the railroad, private documents that could be misunderstood if they fell into the wrong hands. Don't know him. He's about 6 feet tall, scarred face, speaks English like a white man. Thinks he's some kind of crusader for his dead people. Barrett stepped closer, close enough that Caleb could smell the tobacco and whiskey on his breath. His daughter's quite pretty for a savage. Raven Sky, she calls herself. Educated back east, if you can believe it. Some bleeding heart missionary thought he could civilize them. Caleb kept his expression neutral, but his grip on the Colt tightened. See, Mr. Mercer, Barrett continued. The thing about this land is that it's not really cursed. Oh, the Apache believe it is. The townsfolk believe it is. But you and I were rational men. We know there's no such thing as curses. There's just aggressive property management, meaning you killed the previous owners. Me, Barrett pressed a hand to his chest in mock offense. I'm a respectable businessman. I enforce contracts for the Northern Pacific Railroad. If people happen to die on land that the railroad needs for future expansion, well, that's just unfortunate coincidence. The thin gunman had found 2 Eagles' body. Boss got him. Barrett's smile was triumphant. Well, now, Mr. Mercer, seems you did lie to me. That's unfortunate. He drew his pistol in one smooth motion, but Caleb was already moving. The war had taught Caleb many things, but mostly it had taught him that the man who acts first usually lives. His Colt cleared leather and fired before Barrett's gun was level. The bullet caught the railroad man in the shoulder, spinning him around. Boone launched himself at the thin gunman's jaws, clamping on his gun arm. The man screamed, dropping his weapon. Kill them both! Barrett roared, clutching his wounded shoulder. But Caleb was already behind Delilah, using her as cover. He fired twice more, dropping one rider from his saddle. The other 2 scattered, firing wildly. The cabin! Caleb shouted to Boone, who released the thin man's mangled arm and raced toward the structure 50 yards up the path. Caleb grabbed Delilah's reins, using the horse as a shield as he backed toward the cabin. Bullets whined past one, creasing his ribs with fire. Another took his hat off. The cabin door was solid wood, reinforced with iron bands. Caleb shoved through it, Boone right behind him, and barred it just as bullets began splintering the frame. Mercer! Barrett's voice was tight with pain and rage. You just signed your death warrant. Get in line! Caleb shouted back, already taking stock of the cabin. Someone had fortified it recently. Gun ports were cut in strategic positions. Ammunition was stacked in corners, different calibers, like multiple defenders had prepared for a siege. The windows were barricaded with thick planks, leaving only small gaps for shooting. Two Eagles hadn't just been hiding here. He'd been preparing for war. "Burn it," Barrett commanded. "Burn the whole goddamn place." Caleb found a rifle, a beautiful Henry repeater, and checked the load. 16 rounds. He positioned himself at a gun port facing the door. "They try to burn us out, we rush them," he told Boone, who crouched beside him, blood not his own, dripping from his muzzle. "Just like Spotsylvania, remember." The dog's tail thumped once. He remembered. But the fire didn't come. Instead, Caleb heard horses retreating. He waited, counting to 100 before risking a look outside. Barrett and his surviving men were gone, though one body remained in the yard. The thin gunman lay where Boone had mauled him, his throat torn out. Apparently the dog had gone back to finish what he started. "Good boy," Caleb muttered, but he didn't lower his guard. Barrett would be back. Men like him didn't forgive wounds to their pride or their flesh. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains blood red, Caleb finally emerged to bring Two Eagles' body inside. The man deserved better than exposure to scavengers. Searching the body for identification, Caleb found something that made his blood run cold. A document folded small and hidden in Two Eagles' boot. It was a contract signed by Barrett Judge Clarence Crane and 3 U.S. senators. The contract detailed the systematic murder of Apache families to clear land for railroad expansion. Names, dates, amounts paid for scalps. But worse was the addendum. A list of white settlers who'd bought the cleared land marked for elimination once they'd established ownership. The railroad would then reclaim the properties at auction for pennies, just like Caleb had done today. Sarah Chen's name was there, marked completed. Jim Morrison. Completed. The Hendricks boy. Completed. And at the bottom, freshly added in different ink, Caleb Mercer, pending. The cursed land wasn't cursed at all. It was a killing ground, a trap for desperate people who could only afford the cheapest land. The Apache deaths, the settler deaths, all orchestrated to allow the railroad to eventually claim hundreds of acres for almost nothing. A sound from outside made Caleb look up. A lone rider approached in the dying light, hands raised to show no weapons. As the figure got closer, Caleb's breath caught. It was a woman early 20s with the unmistakable features of Apache heritage, mixed with something else Spanish perhaps. Her long black hair was braided in a style that was both traditional and practical. She wore men's clothes, riding pants, and a leather vest, but moved with a grace that transcended her rough attire. "Don't shoot," she called in clear, unaccented English. "I'm looking for my father." Raven sky. It had to be. Caleb stepped out, keeping the rifle ready but pointed down. "You're Two Eagles' daughter." Her face stoic until that moment crumpled. "He's dead, isn't he?" "I'm sorry, I tried to cut him down, but where is he?" Caleb led her inside to where he'd laid Two Eagles on the cabin's single bed covered with a blanket. She knelt beside her father, taking his cold hand in hers. She didn't cry, but her grief was visible in every line of her body. "They tortured him for 3 days," she said quietly, trying to make him reveal where he'd hidden the documents, the proof of what they've done. This proof, Caleb showed her the contract. Her eyes widened. "That's part of it. But there's more, so much more. Account ledgers, correspondence, photographs of the murders." She stood still, entering her voice. "My father spent 2 years gathering evidence. They killed him for it, but they didn't find it." "Where is it?" She studied him carefully. "Why would you care? You're white. This isn't your fight." "Your father made it my fight when he died on my land. Barrett made it my fight when he tried to kill me." Caleb showed her the list with his name. "And apparently I was always meant to die here anyway." She read the document, her expression darkening. "They've been doing this for 5 years. 63 Apache dead, 17 settlers. Also, the railroad can claim prime territory without paying for it. Your father said they have you, that you were captured. I was. 2 days ago. They took us both, tried to make him talk by hurting me." She pulled back her sleeve, revealing burn marks and cuts. He finally agreed to show them where the documents were hidden, led them here instead to the false cache he'd prepared. While they were distracted, I escaped. I've been tracking them, waiting for a chance to... She stopped, looking at the body in the yard. "You killed one of them." "Boone did." Caleb indicated the dog, who was watching the woman with interest but no aggression. He doesn't usually take to strangers, but he seems to like you." She held out her hand. Boone sniffed it, then to Caleb's amazement licked her fingers. "Animals know," she said simply. "They know who can be trusted. Then they know more than people." Caleb walked to the window, watching the darkness gather. "Barrett will be back. Tonight, tomorrow, soon. With more men. Let him come. I know where the real documents are. With them we can destroy Barrett the judge, everyone involved in this conspiracy." She paused. "But I can't get them alone. The hiding place. It requires 2 people." "Then we'd better move fast." She looked at him sharply. "You'd help me. You don't even know me." "I know your father died trying to stop these murders. I know you're willing to die for the same cause. And I know Barrett wants us both dead anyway." Caleb loaded fresh rounds into his Colt. "Seems like good enough reasons to partner up." "You're either very brave or very stupid, Mr. Mercer." "Bit of both, probably." "Call me Caleb." "Raven Sky." She offered her hand and he shook it, noting the calluses from both rifle and pen. This was a woman who could fight and write with equal skill. "The documents are hidden in Devil's Hollow, the old mining camp, but Barrett has men watching it. How many? Usually 3 or 4, but after today he might have reinforced it." Caleb considered their options. "We go tonight. In the dark we might have a chance." "You don't understand. Devil's Hollow isn't just guarded. It's where they—" She trailed off, then forced herself to continue. "It's where they take Apache to torture them. Where they took my mother 3 years ago. She never came out." The pain in her voice was carefully controlled, but Caleb heard it anyway. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Be angry. Help me make them pay." As if in response to her words, Boone began growling. Outside, torches flickered in the distance. Many torches carried by many riders. "Too late," Caleb muttered. "They're here." Raven Sky grabbed the rifle Caleb had been using, checking the action with practiced efficiency. "How much ammunition do we have?" "Maybe 60 rounds mixed calibers. Not enough if they're serious." "They're serious. Barrett doesn't leave witnesses." She moved to another gun port. "But this cabin has secrets. My father prepared for this day." She pressed a particular stone in the fireplace. A section of floor lifted slightly, revealing a hidden cache. More weapons, but also something else dynamite. At least 20 sticks. "Your father was thorough. He was a war chief before the missionaries found him. He never forgot how to fight, just learned to do it with different weapons." She began distributing the explosives around the cabin's windows. "When they come, we hurt them enough to make them pull back. Then we run for Devil's Hollow. In the dark, through hostile territory. Unless you have a better plan." The torches were closer now. Caleb counted at least a dozen riders. Barrett's voice carried across the night air. "Mercer, you've got one chance to surrender. Send out the Apache bitch and the documents, and I might let you live." "Counter offer," Caleb shouted back. "You leave now, and I won't tell everyone that the great Colonel Barrett got shot by a Confederate deserter." He heard Barrett's roar of rage. "Good. Angry men made mistakes. Burn them out!" Flaming arrows began arcing through the night. Most thudded harmlessly against the cabin's walls, but some found the roof. The dry wood began to smoke. "Wait," Raven Sky whispered, lighting the fuses on 3 sticks of dynamite. "Let them get closer." The riders pressed in, firing steadily. Bullets whined through the gun port, showering them with splinters. One caught Raven Sky's cheek, drawing blood. She didn't flinch. "Now," she threw the dynamite through different windows. The explosions lit up the night, sending horses screaming and men flying. In the chaos, Caleb saw their chance. "Back door move." They burst out the rear of the cabin, Boone leading the way. Raven Sky had 2 horses waiting. She'd planned this escape route carefully. As they mounted, the cabin's roof finally caught properly. Flames leaping into the night sky. "After them." Barrett's voice was raw with pain and fury. They rode hard through the darkness, branches tearing at their faces. Raven Sky led, knowing every trail and gulch. Behind them, pursuit crashed through the underbrush. After what felt like hours, but was probably 30 minutes, she suddenly veered off the trail, leading them up a steep ravine. The horses struggled, hooves slipping on loose stone. "They can't follow mounted," she explained. We go on foot from here. They dismounted, sending the horses on with slaps to their rumps. The animals continued up the trail, hopefully drawing pursuit. Raven Sky led them into a narrow crack in the rock face, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The passage opened into a wider cave system. She produced a torch from somewhere, lighting it to reveal ancient paintings on the walls, Apache symbols mixed with something older. "These caves run all through the mountains," she explained. "My people have used them for generations. Barrett doesn't know about them. He knows they exist, but there are 100 passages and most lead nowhere or to death drops. Without a guide," she shrugged. They moved deeper, the air growing colder. Boone stayed close, occasionally growling at sounds only he could hear. After an hour of navigating twisting passages, they emerged on the other side of the mountain. Below them, Devil's Hollow spread out like a cancer. The abandoned mining camp was a collection of rotting buildings and rusted equipment, but lights burned in several structures. Guards patrolled with rifles. There, Raven Sky pointed to a collapsed mine shaft. "The documents are hidden in there, but we'll need to get past the guards." Caleb studied the layout. "How many people has Barrett killed here?" "Dozens, maybe more." Her voice was steady, but her hands clenched. "They have a pit where they dump the bodies. Sometimes they're not quite dead when they go in. Then we give them a taste of their own medicine." Caleb pulled out the remaining dynamite they'd brought. "Create a distraction, draw the guards away, get the documents. And if Barrett himself is down there, then we finish what I started." They descended carefully, using the shadows and scattered boulders for cover. The guards were lazy, comfortable, not expecting trouble. That would be their mistake. Caleb set the dynamite near the largest building, what looked like Barrett's headquarters. The fuse was long, giving them time to get into position near the mine shaft. When it blew, the explosion was spectacular. The building erupted in flames and debris. Guards ran from all directions, shouting, trying to organize a bucket brigade. In the chaos, Caleb and Raven Sky slipped into the mine shaft. It was partially collapsed timbers groaning under the weight of earth. Raven Sky led them deep to a section that looked completely blocked by fallen rocks. "Help me," she said, beginning to pull at specific stones. They came away easily. It was a false wall. Behind it, wrapped in oilcloth, were 3 large bundles. "This is it?" Caleb asked. She opened one bundle, revealing dozens of documents, photographs, and ledgers. Even in the dim light, he could see they were damning. Pictures of murdered families, contracts for killings, bank records showing payments. "This is enough to hang them all," she said with satisfaction. "Then let's go before going somewhere." They spun. Barrett stood at the shaft entrance, backed by 6 men. His shoulder was bandaged, his face pale from blood loss, but his gun was steady. "You know," he said conversationally, "I really did just want the land. The killing was just business, but you two have made it personal." Caleb pushed Raven Sky behind him. "Business murdering innocent people is business. Everything's business, Mercer. The war you fought business, the railroad business. Even justice is just business for whoever can afford it." He cocked his pistol. "Judge Crane is waiting in town with legal documents saying you both died attacking my lawful survey team. Tragic, really. A Confederate deserter and a savage whore killed while trying to murder honest workers. Except we have the proof of what you really are," Raven Sky said, holding up the bundles. Barrett laughed. Proof only matters if someone lives to present it." He raised his gun toward her. Caleb moved without thinking, stepping directly into the line of fire. The bullet took him high in the chest, spinning him around. He felt hard blood immediately pooling beneath him. "No!" Raven Sky dropped beside him, pressing her hands against the wound. "How touching." Barrett stepped closer. "The Confederate dies for the savage. There's poetry in that, don't you think?" That's when Boone struck. The dog had been creeping along the shadows of the mine shaft, invisible in the darkness. He launched himself at Barrett's throat, all 100 pounds of scarred muscle and rage. Barrett went down screaming, his gun flying from his hand. His men hesitated, unsure whether to shoot with their boss in the way. That hesitation was fatal. Raven Sky grabbed Caleb's Colt and fired 6 times, dropping 3 men before they could react. The others fled. Boone was still savaging Barrett, who'd stopped screaming, stopped moving. The dog only released him when Raven Sky called him off. "Good boy," she whispered. then turned her attention to Caleb. "Don't you die on me. Not now. Not planning to—" Caleb gasped, though the pain was extraordinary. "Documents. Get them out. I'm not leaving you. You have to. If they're not delivered, all this was for nothing." She looked torn, then made a decision. With strength that surprised him, she managed to get him on his feet, his arm over her shoulder. "We leave together or not at all?" They staggered from the mine shaft, Boone guarding their rear. The camp was in chaos, the fire spreading to other buildings. In the confusion, they found horses and managed to mount. The ride that followed was a nightmare. Caleb drifted in and out of consciousness, held in the saddle only by Raven Sky's determination. She rode behind him, arms around him to keep him upright, the documents secured in saddlebags. Dawn was breaking as they approached Fort Kearny, the nearest military installation. Caleb was barely conscious, his shirt soaked with blood. But they'd made it. "Stop right there," a sentry called. "I need to see your commanding officer," Raven Sky shouted. "I have evidence of murders committed by the Northern Pacific Railroad. No Apache allowed." "I'm an American citizen," she interrupted. "Educated at Carlisle School, and this man is dying. Get your officer now." Something in her voice made the sentry obey. Within minutes, a young lieutenant appeared, clean-shaven, barely 25, with intelligent eyes. "I'm Lieutenant James Hollister. What's this about murders?" Raven Sky handed him one of the bundles. "Look for yourself. Your father's name is in there, Lieutenant. Senator Thomas Hollister." The young officer's face paled as he read. This can't be." "It is, and there's more. But first, this man needs medical attention." Hollister called for medics, then continued reading. His expression grew increasingly horrified. "My God, my father! He authorized the killing of children." 37 Apache children, Raven Sky confirmed. 15 white settlers, all for land rights. Hollister looked up at her, then at Caleb being carried to the medical tent. "Who are you people?" "We're the ones who stopped it," she said simply. "What happens next is up to you." The lieutenant stood silent for a moment, then straightened. "Sergeant," he called, "send riders to Fort Ellis and Helena. I want federal marshals here within 2 days. And send a telegram to Washington, priority 1. "Sir." The sergeant looked confused. "We're about to arrest some very important people, Sergeant, including my father." His voice was steady, but Raven Sky saw his hands tremble. Justice doesn't get to be selective. As Caleb was carried into the medical tent, he managed to catch Raven Sky's hand. "We did it. We did it," she confirmed. "Rest now." But rest wouldn't come easy. Word of the documents spread quickly. By noon, Judge Crane had arrived with a contingent of hired guns demanding the evidence be turned over to him for proper legal review. Lieutenant Hollister, to his credit, refused. "This is a federal matter now, Judge. These documents are evidence of interstate crime." "You don't understand what you're dealing with, boy," Crane warned. "Important people are involved. People who can destroy your career. People like my father." Hollister's voice was ice. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with." The standoff continued through the day. Raven Sky refused to leave Caleb's side even as the doctor worked to extract the bullet. Boone lay at the foot of the bed, growling at anyone who came too close. That night she told Caleb stories to keep him conscious, stories of her people of the land before the railroad came, of her mother who'd taught her to read and write, of her father who'd taught her to fight. "He would have liked you," she said. "You did what he couldn't, you made them listen." "Not me," Caleb corrected weakly. You're the one who wouldn't give up." On the second day, the federal marshals arrived. With them came newspaper reporters from Helena, eager for the story. Raven Sky gave them everything, holding nothing back. The photographs of murdered families were particularly damning. Judge Crane tried to flee but was arrested at the train station. Barrett's surviving men turned state's evidence, confirming everything in the documents. Senator Hollister, when word reached Washington, resigned in disgrace rather than face trial. Lieutenant Hollister, despite the personal cost, ensured every document was properly filed as evidence. "My father made his choices," he told Raven Sky. "I'll make better ones." It took a week for Caleb to be stable enough to travel. During that time, Ravensky never left his side. They talked about everything and nothing, about the war, about loss, about what came next. "The land," Caleb said one evening. "Whispering Creek. It's really yours, you know, your people's." "No," she corrected. "It's ours. Bought and paid for with blood. We'll make something of it. Together. Together." He studied her face. "You'd stay with a broken-down Confederate." "I'd stay with the man who took a bullet for me, who fought for justice when he had every reason not to care." She squeezed his hand. "If you'll have me. I'm not exactly prime husband material. I've got more scars than prospects." "Good thing I'm not looking for a husband, then. I'm looking for a partner." They were married a month later in a ceremony that blended Apache tradition with frontier practicality. Lieutenant Hollister served as witness, having resigned his commission to practice law specializing in indigenous rights. Whispering Creek Ranch prospered under their joint management. They raised cattle and horses, but also provided sanctuary for Apache families displaced by the railroad expansion. The curse never manifested again, as if the land itself was satisfied that justice had been served. Caleb built a school on the property where Ravensky taught both Apache and white children to read and write. "Education is the best revenge," she said. The Northern Pacific Railroad was forced to pay reparations, though never enough to truly compensate for the lives lost. But it was a start, a precedent that would be cited in courts for decades to come. 5 years after that bloody night at Devil's Hollow, Caleb and Ravensky stood at Two Eagles' grave, now properly marked and tended. Their children, 3 of them mixed heritage, and proud of it, played nearby under Boone's watchful eye. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Everything you gave up, the simple life you could have had." Caleb pulled her close, looking out over their land that had cost so much but given them everything. "I paid 12 cents for this place," he said. "Best investment I ever made. Even with all the blood. Especially with all the blood. It made the victory mean something." As the sun set over Whispering Creek, painting the mountains gold, Caleb thought about that day in the courthouse. The crowd calling him a dead man walking. They'd been right, in a way. The man who'd bought this land for 12 cents had died here. But from that death had come something better. A partnership. A family. A future that neither of them could have imagined when they first met over Two Eagles' body. The land wasn't cursed anymore. It was redeemed. And so were they. Boone, now gray around the muzzle but still vigilant, barked once at the setting sun. A warning, perhaps. Or a celebration. With him, it was hard to tell the difference. "Come on," Ravensky said, gathering the children. "Dinner's waiting." As they walked back to the cabin, expanded, now filled with life and laughter, Caleb paused at the gate, the same gate where everything had started. There was no trace of blood now, no sign of the violence that had launched their story. But he remembered. They both did. And in remembering, they honored all who had died for this ground. "Papa, why are you stopping?" his eldest daughter asked. "Just thinking, little one." "About what?" "About how sometimes the worst deals turn out to be the best ones." She looked confused, but Ravensky understood. She took his hand, and together they walked through the gate of Whispering Creek Ranch. Their ranch. Their home. Their redemption bought with blood and courage and worth every drop of both. The ravens still gathered, sometimes watching from the fence posts, but they no longer cawed warnings of death. Now they seemed more like guardians, keeping watch over a land that had seen too much blood, but had finally found peace. And in the distance, if you listened carefully on quiet nights, you could hear the wind through Whispering Creek. It didn't sound like screaming anymore. It sounded like singing. The singing wind through Whispering Creek had become their morning ritual. But this dawn brought something different. Caleb woke to find Ravensky already dressed, standing at the window with a letter clutched in her hands. Her face, usually so composed, showed cracks of worry that made his healing chest wound ache in sympathy. "What is it?" He rose carefully from their bed, the bullet wound from 3 months ago still pulling when he moved too quickly. Lieutenant Hollister sent a warning. She handed him the letter, her fingers trembling slightly. "They're coming for us. All of them." Caleb read quickly, his expression darkening with each line. Senator Hollister hadn't accepted his disgrace quietly. He'd hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency along with what Hollister described as private military contractors, mercenaries in plain speak, They were a day out from Whispering Creek, maybe less. How many? Caleb asked. Already knowing the answer wouldn't be good. 30 men, maybe more, led by someone called Marcus Vale. Ravensky's voice carried a weight that made Caleb look up sharply. You know that name, Vale. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. He was at Andersonville, ran the prison camp like his personal kingdom. They say he kept a collection of finger bones from prisoners who died under his watch. And now he's coming here. She moved to their gun cabinet, checking weapons with practiced efficiency. We can't fight 30 men, Caleb, not with 3 children to protect. Their children were still sleeping, Emma, age 4, named after the shopkeeper's daughter who'd shown them kindness. Thomas 3 carrying Two Eagles' middle name, and baby Sarah just 10 months old. The thought of Vale and his men anywhere near them made Caleb's hands curl into fists. We run, he said, though the words burned his throat. Take the children to Fort Kearney. They'll follow. And the fort won't protect us, not against Pinkertons with federal connections. Ravensky loaded a rifle with steady hands. Besides, running means abandoning the others. The others were the 7 Apache families who'd settled on Whispering Creek over the past months. Refugees from the government's increasingly aggressive relocation policies, they'd built a small community in the valley's south corner. Leaving them to Vale's mercy or lack thereof was unthinkable. Then we make our stand, Caleb said. But we do it smart. Send the families to the caves. They know the passages better than anyone. And us, we give Vale what he wants, or what he thinks he wants. Ravensky studied her husband's face. She'd learned to read his expressions, the subtle shifts that indicated when his military mind was working. You have a plan. The beginning of one. Wake the children, quietly. Within an hour, the small community was in motion. The Apache families moved with practiced silence, gathering essentials and disappearing into the mountain passages Ravensky's people had used for generations. The children went with them, Emma clutching her father's old cavalry pistol unloaded, but she didn't know that. Papa has to handle some business, Caleb told her, kneeling despite the pain it caused. You protect your mother, and brothers understood. Yes, Papa. Her serious expression, so like her mother's, nearly broke his composure. Will you come find us? Always. Old Joseph Crow. Feather, the eldest of the Apache refugees, paused before entering the caves. This is our fight too, Mercer. We should stand with you. Your fight is keeping those children safe, Caleb replied. That's what matters. Joseph nodded slowly, understanding the weight of that trust. He disappeared into the mountain's embrace, leaving Caleb and Ravensky alone, except for Boone, who paced the cabin with increasing agitation. He knows trouble's coming, Ravensky observed. He always does. Caleb began his own preparations, but not the ones Vale might expect. He took the original documents, the ones that had brought down Senator Hollister and Judge Crane, and placed them prominently on the table. Then he began writing, his hand moving quickly across paper. What are you doing? Creating bait. Vale thinks he's coming for evidence and witnesses. We'll give him both, just not the way he expects. The sound of horses reached them just after noon, many horses moving with military precision. Caleb and Ravensky took their positions, but they didn't hide. When Marcus Vale rode into view, they were standing on their front porch, weapons visible but not raised. Vale looked exactly as Caleb remembered, only worse. The years had carved cruelty deeper into his features, turning what might once have been handsome into something predatory. He wore expensive clothes that couldn't hide the killer beneath, and his pale gray eyes held the same dead quality Caleb had seen in Andersonville's worst guards. Caleb Mercer, Vale called out, his voice carrying that false friendliness that preceded violence. Been a long time since Georgia. Not long enough. Vale laughed to sound like breaking glass. Still holding grudges. That was war, Mercer. This is business. Funny how often those two things overlap with you. The 30 men behind Vale spread out in a practiced pattern surrounding the cabin. Professional killers, everyone. Not the usual railroad thugs, but men who'd learned their trade in places where law was a suggestion and morality was weakness. Senator Hollister sends his regards, Vale continued. He's particularly upset about his son's betrayal. Seems young James has been using family information to build legal cases against his own father. Unnatural, really. Oh, What's unnatural is murdering children for land. Raven Sky spoke for the first time. Vale's attention shifted to her, his gaze crawling over her in a way that made Caleb's finger itch for his trigger. The famous Raven Sky. You know there's quite a bounty on you. Seems you've been helping Apache avoid relocation. That's federal crime, technically. Technically, you can go to hell. Such language from an educated woman. Vale dismounted, his hand resting on his pistol. Here's how this works. You give us all copies of those documents. You sign confessions stating you fabricated the evidence. Then you disappear permanently. In return, Senator Hollister forgets you exist. And if we refuse, Caleb asked, though he knew the answer, then this becomes unpleasant. You die badly. Your wife dies worse. And those Apache families hiding in the mountains, well, we'll smoke them out like rabbits. I understand you have children with them. The threat against their children nearly broke Caleb's control. Only Raven Sky's steady hand on his arm kept him from drawing. We need time to consider, she said. You have 1 hour. Vale smiled, showing too many teeth. Then we come in and take what we want anyway. As Vale's men settled into siege positions, Caleb and Raven Sky retreated inside. Through the window, they could see men taking positions that would make escape impossible. He'll kill us regardless, Raven Sky stated the obvious. Yes, but he doesn't know about Hollister's letter, or that we've already sent copies of everything to newspapers in Chicago and Washington. Caleb showed her what he'd been writing. Our life insurance policy. She read quickly. You're confessing to killing Barrett. I did kill Barrett, or Boone did close enough. But this confession includes details only the killer would know and evidence that Vale was hired to cover it up. He sealed the letter. If we die, this goes to every newspaper in the country. If we die, I prefer when we live. Working on that part. A commotion outside drew their attention. Riders approaching from the east, but not Vale's men. These wore cavalry blue. Lieutenant Hollister had come bringing 10 soldiers from Fort Kearny. Vale went to meet him, and even from distance, the tension was visible. Hollister might have been young, but he sat his horse with authority that came from righteousness rather than rank. Stand down, Mr. Vale. Hollister's voice carried clearly. These people are under federal protection. With what authority? Vale seemed amused rather than concerned. Last I heard, you resigned your commission. I've been reinstated. Special investigator for the War Department looking into corruption in territorial affairs. Hollister produced a document. This gives me authority over all federal matters in Montana Territory. Vale examined the papers, then laughed. 10 soldiers against 30 professional fighters. Boy, your father should have taught you better math. My father taught me many things, most of them wrong. Hollister's voice hardened. But he did teach me that men like you respond only to force. So here's my force, those documents you want. They're already in federal custody. Copies have been sent to President Grant himself. Killing these witnesses now only adds to the charges. Charges require trials. Trials require living witnesses. Which is why I'm here. Mr. and Mrs. Mercer are coming with me to testify before a federal grand jury in Washington. Caleb and Raven Sky exchanged glances. This was unexpected. Vale's friendly mask finally slipped. You're making a mistake, Hollister. Your father has friends. Powerful friends. My father is going to federal prison. His friends are distancing themselves as we speak. Hollister rode closer to Vale, close enough that their horses touched. I know what you did at Andersonville Vale. I have the records. 1,600 deaths under your watch, most from intentional starvation. There's no statute of limitations on war crimes. For the first time, Vale looked uncertain. You're bluffing. Test me. The standoff stretched taut as piano wire. 30 guns against 10, but those 10 wore federal uniforms. Attacking them would bring the entire U.S. Army down on Vale's head. Finally, Vale stepped back. This isn't over. Yes, it is, Hollister motioned to Caleb and Raven Sky. Mr. and Mrs. Mercer, please gather what you need. We leave immediately. As they quickly packed essentials, Raven Sky whispered, Can we trust him? We can trust that he hates his father more than he hates us, Caleb replied. Sometimes that's enough. They emerged with saddlebags and Boone at their heels. Vale's men watched with predatory patience held back only by those blue uniforms. The Apache families stay, Vale said suddenly. They're not under federal protection. Actually, they are. Hollister produced another document. Presidential order signed yesterday. All residents of Whispering Creek Ranch are granted federal sanctuary pending investigation of territorial crimes. Your father must be so proud, Vale sneered. My father is the reason I'm doing this. Hollister's voice carried pain masked as resolve. Every life he destroyed demands justice. As they prepared to ride out, one of Vale's men suddenly moved. Caleb saw the gun coming up aimed at Hollister's back. Without thinking, he drew and fired his bullet, taking the would-be assassin in the chest. The man fell, and 30 guns swung toward Caleb. Hold, Vale commanded, but his voice carried reluctant respect. Anyone else moves, I'll shoot you myself. Wise choice, Hollister said calmly, though sweat beaded his forehead. Mr. Mercer just saved my life. That makes him a federal hero. Heroes are hard to disappear. They rode out slowly, the weight of 30 hostile gazes following them. Only when they'd cleared the valley did anyone speak. That was brave what you did, Hollister said to Caleb. That was instinct. I see a back shooter, I shoot first. Still, I owe you. You owe us nothing, Raven Sky interjected. You're risking everything standing against your own father. My father risked everything for money and power. I'm risking everything for justice. There's a difference. They made camp that night in a defensible position, soldiers keeping watch. Around the fire, Hollister revealed more of his plan. The grand jury convenes in 2 weeks. Your testimony combined with the documents will ensure convictions. But Vale was right about one thing: my father has powerful friends. They'll try to stop you from testifying. Let them try, Caleb said. You don't understand. These aren't just hired guns. There are senators, judges, even generals involved in this land scheme. The corruption goes all the way to Washington. Then we take it all the way to Washington, Raven Sky said firmly. My father didn't die for half measures. Hollister studied them both. You realize what you're risking. They'll come after your children, your friends, everyone you care about. They already have, Caleb pointed out. Might as well make it count. The journey to the railhead took 3 days. 3 days of looking over their shoulders, of starting at every sound. Vale's men shadowed them just out of sight, waiting for opportunity. It came the second night. Caleb woke to Boone's warning growl. Shadows moved beyond the firelight's reach. He nudged Raven Sky, a wake hand already on his gun. The attack came from 3 directions at once. Not Vale's men, these were Apache, but not any Caleb recognized. They moved with lethal purpose arrows, finding 2 soldiers before anyone could react. Renegades, Hollister shouted. Defensive position. But Raven Sky was already standing, hands raised, speaking rapidly in Apache. The attackers hesitated, recognizing her. One warrior, his face painted for war, stepped forward. You are Two Eagles' daughter. I am. You ride with the blue coats who steal our land. I ride with those who seek justice for our people. These soldiers protect us from worse men. The warrior considered this. We heard you keep Apache on your land, that you defy the removal orders. We do. Then why trust these whites? Because not all whites are the same, just as not all Apache are the same. She gestured to Caleb. This man killed for our people, bled for them. He earned trust. The warriors discussed quietly among themselves. Finally, their leader spoke. We came to kill you for betraying our people. Now we see you play a longer game. Help us play it, Raven Sky offered. Vale's men follow us. They mean to kill us before we can testify against those who murdered our people. The warrior smiled, expression that promised violence. Vale, we know this name. He burned our winter camp last year, killed 20 mostly women and children. Then perhaps you'd like to return the favor. The attack on Vale's camp that night was swift and brutal. The Apache warriors struck like ghosts, using the darkness and their knowledge of the terrain. Vale himself barely escaped, wounded by an arrow that would leave him with a permanent limp. By dawn, his force was scattered, demoralized, no longer a threat. Your friends are efficient, Hollister observed, looking at the abandoned camp. They're not my friends, Ravensky corrected. But we have common enemies. Sometimes that's enough. They reached the railroad without further incident, boarding a special car Hollister had arranged. Federal marshals met them, providing additional security. As the train pulled away from Montana, Caleb watched the mountains recede and wondered if they'd ever see Whispering Creek again. "We will," Ravensky said, reading his thoughts, as she often did. "This is our home. We'll return. After we testify. After the trials. After we win." The train journey to Washington took a week. A week of luxury. Caleb had never experienced private compartments, prepared meals, clean beds. But also a week of increasing tension as they neared the center of power. Hollister spent the time preparing them for what was coming. The grand jury will be hostile. Half of them have connections to the land schemes. They'll try to discredit you, paint you as vengeful liars. "Then we'll give them truth they can't deny," Ravensky said. "Truth isn't always enough in Washington," Hollister warned. "Politics matters more." "Then we'll give them politics too." She produced a leather portfolio. "These are letters from missionaries, army officers, even territorial governors, all confirming parts of our story. Your father wasn't the only one keeping records." Hollister read through them, his expression shifting from surprise to admiration. "How did you get these?" "My father spent 2 years building his case. He knew documents could be destroyed, so he gathered witnesses. Many are too frightened to testify, but their letters carry weight. This changes everything. With these, we can expand the investigation beyond my father." Washington appeared on the horizon like a fever dream of white marble and black smoke. The capital was rebuilding after the war construction, everywhere the air thick with the sound of hammers and the smell of fresh mortar. They were housed in a federal building, guards posted at every entrance. The prosecutor, a thin man named Wallace with the demeanor of an undertaker, visited that first night. "Your testimony is scheduled for tomorrow," he said without preamble. "The grand jury has already heard from several witnesses who claim you fabricated evidence." "Let me guess," Caleb said. "Men on Senator Hollister's payroll." "That's immaterial. What matters is your credibility. Mrs. Mercer, they'll attack you for being Apache. Mr. Mercer, they'll paint you as a bitter Confederate seeking revenge on the Union." "And we'll tell the truth," Ravensky said simply. Wallace sighed. "Truth is subjective in this city. What matters is perception." "Then we'll give them perception." Caleb stood pacing to the window. "Bring in the families. The Apache families from Whispering Creek. Let the jury see the children who survived the massacres. Emotional manipulation won't work on these men. Not manipulation, reality." Ravensky joined her husband at the window. "These men have never seen the cost of their policies, never looked into the eyes of orphans their greed created. Make them see." Wallace considered this. "It could backfire, make you seem desperate." "We are desperate," Caleb said. "Desperate for justice. If that's a crime, then we're guilty." The grand jury convened in a room that smelled of old wood and older power. 23 men, all white, all wealthy, sat in judgment. Senator Hollister was notably absent already under house arrest. The prosecutor began with the documents, laying out the evidence methodically. Bank records, contracts, correspondence, a paper trail of blood and greed. The jury listened with studied indifference, as if hearing about grain futures rather than murder. Then Caleb testified. He spoke simply without emotion, describing finding 2 eagles, the attack by Barrett, the fight for the documents. He showed his scars, the bullet wound still fresh enough to make his point. "Mr. Mercer," one juror interrupted, "you're a former Confederate soldier, are you not?" "I am. And you harbor resentment toward the federal government." "I harbor resentment toward murderers. Their uniform doesn't matter." "Yet you married an Apache woman. Some might say that shows bias." "I married a woman who saved my life. Her race is irrelevant to her character." The questioning continued for hours, each juror trying to find cracks in his story. But Caleb had survived worse interrogations in war. He answered simply, directly, never elaborating beyond what was asked. Ravensky's testimony was different. She spoke with passionate precision, naming every victim she knew, describing the massacres in detail that made several jurors visibly uncomfortable. "These are stories," one juror protested. "Hearsay." "Then let me show you proof." She produced photographs they hadn't seen before, images of mass graves of burned villages of children's bodies arranged for burial. My father took these. He documented everything because he knew men like you would demand evidence. The room fell silent. The photographs passed from hand to hand, each juror forced to look at what their policies had wrought. This could be from anywhere, someone said weakly. Look at the backgrounds. Those are Montana mountains. That's the Northern Pacific Railroad marker. That's Judge Crane standing over the bodies. She pointed to each detail. This isn't anywhere. This is what you allowed to happen. Lieutenant Hollister testified last, and his words carried special weight. A son testifying against his father, a former officer exposing military corruption, it was drama even jaded Washington couldn't ignore. My father believed progress justified any means, he said quietly. He taught me that civilization required sacrificing the uncivilized, but what I've seen, what these people revealed, shows we're the uncivilized ones. We're the savages. The grand jury deliberated for 3 days. 3 days of closed doors and hushed conversations. Word leaked that they were divided, that powerful forces were applying pressure. On the third night, Wallace came to their quarters with a grim expression. There's been a development. They're dropping the charges, Caleb guessed. Worse. Senator Hollister is dead. Suicide, they're saying. Hung himself in his study. Lieutenant Hollister, who'd been staying with them for protection, went very still. My father wouldn't kill himself. He was too proud, too certain he'd escape justice. Nevertheless, he's dead, and with him dies much of the case. Dead men can't be tried. But the others, Judge Crane, the railroad executives, are claiming they were following Hollister's orders, that he was the mastermind, they were just employees. That's a lie. Ravensky stood abruptly. We have documents proving they were all involved equally. Documents can be interpreted many ways. Wallace looked defeated. I'm sorry, politics wins again. But Lieutenant Hollister wasn't listening. He was staring at a telegram that had just arrived, his face cycling through emotions, shock, grief, then something harder. My father's dead, he said slowly. But he sent this before he died. Or someone sent it for him. He showed them the telegram. It contained just 2 words and an address, insurance policy. What does it mean? Wallace asked. It means my father really did plan for everything. Hollister stood. We need to go to this address. Tonight. The address led to a small bank in Georgetown. Hollister's name was on a safety deposit box arranged years ago by his father. Inside were more documents, but these were different. These showed the corruption reaching even higher to cabinet members, to friends of the president himself. My God, Wallace breathed. This implicates half of Washington. My father's real insurance, Hollister said bitterly. If he went down, he was taking everyone with him. The second round of grand jury hearings was a sensation. Newspapers from across the country sent reporters. The documents Senator Hollister had hidden were undeniable names and dates and amounts that painted a picture of systemic corruption. Judge Crane broke first, confessing everything in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony led to more arrests, more trials, a cascade of justice that shocked even cynical observers. But Vail remained free. No evidence directly linked him to the murders, and his Pinkerton credentials gave him cover. He disappeared one night, leaving only a message for Caleb, "This isn't over." The trials continued for months. Caleb and Ravensky became reluctant celebrities, their story told and retold in newspapers and dime novels. But they wanted only to return home to their children, to Whispering Creek. Finally, in spring, they were free to go. The government, embarrassed by the scandal, offered reparations money for the Apache family's clear title to Whispering Creek promises of protection. Promises are cheap in Washington, Ravensky observed as they boarded the train home. But legal titles are harder to break, Hollister said. He was traveling with them, having accepted a position as territorial prosecutor in Montana. I'll make sure your land stays yours. The journey home felt longer than the journey out. Every mile brought memories of 2 eagles of Barrett, of all the blood spilled for those 12 acres. When they finally saw Whispering Creek's gate, their children were waiting. Emma ran first, launching herself into her father's arms. Thomas and baby Sarah followed the family, reuniting in tears and laughter. The Apache families had cared for the ranch in their absence. The cabin was expanded, new buildings erected, crops planted. It looked like what it was, a community built on shared struggle and mutual respect. "Welcome home," Joseph Crowfeather said simply. That night they held a feast, Apache and White together sharing food and stories. Lieutenant Hollister, awkward at first, gradually relaxed as he realized he was among friends. "You did it," Joseph told Caleb and Raven Sky. "You got justice." "We got some justice," Caleb corrected. "Vale's still free. The railroad still operates. The government still wants Apache land. But now they know we'll fight," Raven Sky added, "that we have allies that we can win. That changes everything." As the celebration continued, Caleb walked alone to Two Eagles' grave. The marker was well-tended flowers placed regularly by the Apache families. "We did what we could," he said to the stone. "Your daughter is safe. Your evidence convicted them. It's not enough, but it's something." The wind through Whispering Creek seemed to answer that singing sound that had replaced the screaming. Perhaps it was imagination, but Caleb thought he heard approval in it. Raven Sky found him there, slipping her hand into his. "He would be proud of you. You're the one who never gave up." "We never gave up. That's what makes us strong." They stood together in the darkness, looking out over their land. 12 acres bought for 12 cents, paid for in blood, defended with courage, and finally, truly, theirs. "Vale will come back," Caleb said eventually. "Let him come. We'll be ready. The government will try again to take Apache lands. And we'll fight again. It never ends, does it?" "No." Raven Sky squeezed his hand, "but neither do we." Boone padded up, older now, but still alert, still protective. He settled at their feet, content to guard his people as he always had. The moon rose over Whispering Creek's silver light, turning the landscape into something magical. The ranch that had been cursed was now blessed. The land that had drunk blood now nurtured life. But even in peace, they remained vigilant. Vale was out there somewhere, planning his return. The government's appetite for Apache land hadn't diminished. The fight for justice was won in battles, not wars. Still, for tonight, they had this: family community home. 12 acres of Montana that belonged to them in ways that went beyond deeds and titles. "Papa," Emma appeared, rubbing sleepy eyes. "Are you coming back to the party?" "We're coming, little one." As they walked back to the cabin, 3 generations under Montana's stars, Caleb thought about the journey that had brought them here. From a desperate 12-cent purchase to federal trials, from cursed ground to hallowed home. The story wasn't over. Stories like theirs never really ended. But this chapter at least concluded with something rare in the West Justice family and land that was truly theirs. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Vale's vendetta, government pressure, the endless struggle for survival in a hard land. But tonight, Whispering Creek sang with joy, and that was enough. The cabin glowed with lamplight and laughter. Their community, built on shared suffering and mutual respect, had survived its first great test. There would be others, Caleb knew, but they would face them as they had faced everything else together. As they reached the cabin door, Raven Sky paused. "Do you regret it? Any of it? The killing? Sometimes. The pain? Always." Caleb met her eyes. "But the result, never. This place, these people, our family, I'd pay any price for this. Even 12 cents. Especially 12 cents. They entered their home, rejoining the celebration, but the weight of what was coming never left their minds. Somewhere in the darkness, forces gathered against them. The fight for Whispering Creek was won, but the war for justice had only just begun. The war for justice had only just begun, and it announced itself with smoke on the horizon 3 weeks later. Caleb spotted it first while checking the fence line with Thomas, his 3-year-old son, perched in front of him on Delilah's saddle. The black plume rose from the direction of the Patterson homestead 5 miles east. "Fire, Papa?" Thomas asked, his small fingers pointing. "Stay here with your mother," Caleb said, spurring toward the cabin where Raven Sky was teaching the Apache children their letters. She took one look at his face and reached for her rifle. "The Pattersons." "Maybe. Take the children to the caves just in case. You're not going alone. Someone has to. If it's Vale, you'll need backup." She turned to Emma, their eldest. "Run to Joseph's cabin. Tell him to gather the men. Your father and I are riding to the Patterson place." They rode hard toward the smoke, Boone running alongside despite his advancing years. The dog's loyalty never wavered, even as his muzzle grew wider and his stride less certain. As they crested the final ridge, the scene below stopped them cold. The Patterson farmhouse was a smoking ruin, but worse were the bodies arranged in the yard. Tom Patterson, his wife Mary, their 2 sons. Not just killed, but displayed position to send a message, and painted on the barn's remaining wall in what looked like blood. "Mercer, you're next." "Vale," Raven Sky breathed. "Or someone wanting us to think it's Vale." Caleb dismounted, studying the scene with eyes trained by war. The bodies are fresh, maybe 2 hours, but the fire's been burning longer. And these tracks? He knelt, examining the ground. Shod horses, but the pattern's wrong. Military shoes, not civilian. The army. Or someone with access to army equipment. He stood, pieces clicking together in his mind. "We need to get back. This is a distraction." They were halfway home when they heard the gunfire. Multiple rifles, the sharp crack of disciplined volleys rather than the chaotic noise of a skirmish. Caleb's blood went cold. The ranch was under attack, but not how they'd expected. 20 soldiers in federal blue had surrounded Joseph Crow Feather's cabin, where the Apache families had gathered. Lieutenant Morrison, whom Caleb recognized from Fort Kearney, stood with official papers while his men held rifles on the terrified families. "What the hell is this?" Caleb demanded, riding directly into the formation. Morrison, a young officer trying to look older with an unsuccessful mustache, straightened nervously. "Official business, Mr. Mercer. These Apache are being relocated to the reservation. Federal orders." "These people are under presidential protection. You saw the documents yourself. Those protections expired last week. New administration, new policies." Morrison handed over the papers, which bore official seals and signatures. "They have 1 hour to gather belongings." "This is our land," Raven Sky said, her voice dangerously quiet. "These people are here legally." "The law's changed, ma'am. All Apache must report to designated reservations, no exceptions." Joseph Crow Feather emerged from his cabin, dignity intact despite having rifles aimed at him. "We will not go. This is our home now." "Then you'll be moved by force." Morrison's voice cracked slightly, betraying his youth and discomfort. "I have my orders." "Your orders are illegal." Lieutenant Hollister's voice cut through the tension. He rode up with 3 territorial marshals, his prosecutor's badge glinting. "These people are witnesses in ongoing federal trials. They cannot be relocated without court approval." Morrison looked confused. "Sir, my commander said—" "Your commander is exceeding his authority. Stand down your men immediately." "I can't do that. Colonel Brennan specifically—" "Brennan." Hollister's face darkened. "Thomas Brennan." "Yes, sir. He took command of Fort Kearney last month." Caleb and Hollister exchanged glances. Brennan was another name from the documents, another conspirator who'd escaped prosecution when Senator Hollister died. "This isn't relocation," Caleb said quietly. "This is revenge." Before Morrison could respond, shots rang out from the tree line. Not at them, at the soldiers. 2 men fell and chaos erupted. The soldiers scattered for cover, firing blindly at the forest. The Apache families ran for the cabin as bullets filled the air. "Cease fire!" Morrison screamed, but his men were panicked, shooting at shadows. Through the smoke and confusion, Caleb saw them riders emerging from 3 directions, not wearing blue, but civilian clothes. Vale's men using the chaos to attack. They'd been waiting for this moment when the ranch's defenders were divided and confused. "It's a trap!" Caleb shouted, firing at the nearest rider. "Morrison, they're after you too." The young lieutenant looked bewildered until a bullet took his hat off. Reality crashed home. He and his men were targets just like everyone else. Defensive positions. Hollister took command with natural authority. Federal forces and civilians together protect the families. The next minutes were the longest kind of combat, confused, desperate, with no clear lines. Soldiers who'd come to arrest the Apache now fought beside them. Vale's mercenaries pressed from all sides, using the burning Patterson smoke as cover for their approach. Raven Sky had made it to the children gathering them in the root cellar beneath the main cabin. But Vale himself appeared at the cabin door, his scarred face twisted with satisfaction. Hello, Mrs. Mercer. Time to finish what we started. She shot him twice before he could draw both bullets hitting center mass. But Vale was wearing armor beneath his coat, modern steel plates that turned her bullets. He backhanded her across the face, sending her sprawling. Did you think I'd come unprepared? He advanced, drawing a knife. Your husband cost me everything. My reputation, my contracts, my men. So I'm going to cost him everything, starting with you. That's when Emma shot him. The 4-year-old had found her father's cavalry pistol, the one she'd carried unloaded during their flight to the caves. But Joseph Crow Feather had loaded it, teaching her in secret, knowing that frontier children sometimes needed to defend themselves. The small caliber bullet found the gap between Vale's armor plates, entering just below his armpit. He screamed, dropping the knife, clutching at the wound that shouldn't have been possible. You little... Boone hit him from behind Age's jaws, finding Vale's throat despite the years. The dog bore him down, and this time Vale didn't get back up. Outside, the battle was turning. Morrison's soldiers, once they understood the situation, fought with disciplined precision. Vale's mercenaries, expecting easy victims, found themselves facing trained troops and desperate families fighting for their homes. But the cost was terrible. 3 soldiers dead, 2 Apache men, including Joseph Crow Feather, who died protecting the children. Morrison himself was badly wounded, gut shot, and fading. I'm sorry, he gasped to Caleb as they tried to stop the bleeding. I didn't know. Brennan said it was just routine relocation. Save your strength, Caleb told him, but they both knew it was too late. Tell my mother, tell her I died well. He was gone before sunset, another young man dead for old men's greed. Hollister took charge of the survivors, sending riders to Fort Ellis for reinforcements and medical help. But they all knew this was just the beginning. Brennan had shown his hand, and he had the full weight of military authority behind him. We can't fight the U.S. Army, one of the Apache men said that night as they buried their dead. We don't have to, Hollister replied. We fight the law with law. Brennan overstepped. Morrison and his men died because of illegal orders. That's court-martial territory. Courts need evidence, Ravensky pointed out, holding Emma close. The little girl hadn't spoken since shooting Vale, her eyes wide with shock at what she'd done. Then we get evidence. Caleb stood from where he'd been tending Boone's wounds. The old dog had been stabbed in the fight, but would survive. Brennan's not smart enough to plan this alone. Someone's backing him. The railroad, Hollister said. Has to be. They're making another push for territorial expansion. Then we stop them. Again. But stopping them would require allies, and those were in short supply. The next morning brought a federal judge named Harrison, accompanied by 50 soldiers from Fort Ellis. He was everything Judge Crane had been: corrupt, arrogant, and utterly confident in his power. This ranch is now under federal seizure, he announced, reading from official documents. Due to harboring fugitive Apache and resisting lawful relocation, all property rights are suspended pending investigation. You can't do that, Hollister protested. I'm a federal prosecutor, so we're a federal prosecutor. You've been removed from your position effective immediately. Harrison handed him dismissal papers. Apparently someone in Washington doesn't appreciate your enthusiasm for lost causes. This is illegal. This is reality, young man. You fought the law, and the law won. Harrison turned to Caleb and Ravensky. You have 24 hours to vacate. The Apache leave immediately for the reservation. Resist, and you'll be arrested for treason. Treason? Caleb laughed bitterly. For protecting people on my own land. For undermining federal Indian policy during a time of territorial crisis. Harrison's smile was cold. Yes, Mr. Mercer, they've decided to play that card. Continue resisting, and you'll hang for it. The Apache families were loaded onto wagons despite protests and tears. Children were separated from the white families they'd grown up with. The scene was heartbreaking, but the soldiers were implacable. We'll find you, Ravensky promised the departing families. We'll bring you home. Home is gone, Joseph's widow replied. They always win in the end. As the wagons rolled away, Emma finally spoke. Papa, I killed a man. Caleb knelt beside his daughter, searching for words to explain what couldn't be explained to a child. You saved your mother. You protected your family. But he's dead. Yes, And that's something you'll carry forever. But you're alive, and so is Mama, and that's what matters. Will I go to hell? It was Raven Sky who answered, gathering her daughter close. No, my brave girl. Warriors who protect their people don't go to hell. They become stars watching over those they love. That night, they made camp in the hills above Whispering Creek, watching soldiers patrol their land. Everything they'd built, everything they'd fought for, taken with a judge's signature. We could run, Hollister suggested. Canada's not far. We don't run, Caleb replied. We've bled too much for this land to abandon it now. Then what do? We fight smarter. Raven Sky was studying the documents Harrison had left, finding flaws. Look at this. The seizure order is predicated on harboring fugitive Apache. But we have presidential protection documents. They're contradicting their own paperwork. Bureaucratic incompetence, Hollister mused, might be enough for an appeal. Not an appeal. A congressional hearing. Caleb pulled out a letter he'd been saving. Before we left Washington, Senator Sherman gave me this. Said if the corruption continued to contact him directly. Sherman? The General Sherman. Same man. Seems he has opinions about railroad corruption and army misuse. Caleb began writing by firelight. Time to see if his word's good. They sent the letter through 3 different routes to ensure it arrived. Then they waited hidden in the cave systems supplied secretly by sympathetic townspeople who'd grown to respect what they'd built at Whispering Creek. Lieutenant Morrison's mother arrived a week later demanding answers about her son's death. When she learned the truth that he'd died because of illegal orders and railroad scheming, she became an unexpected ally. My son wrote about you, she told Caleb in Raven Sky. Said you were the only honest people in this godforsaken territory. If he died defending you, then I'll see his killers punished. Mrs. Morrison had connections in Eastern newspapers. Soon the story of Whispering Creek was front-page news in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. The narrative of corrupt officers and stolen land resonated with a public tired of Western lawlessness. Colonel Brennan responded by declaring martial law, claiming Apache uprising threatened the territory. He used this excuse to seize more ranches, always those sitting on land the railroad wanted. He's overplaying his hand, Hollister observed. Martial law requires presidential approval for extension beyond 30 days. Then we make sure he doesn't get it. Caleb had been corresponding with other ranchers building a coalition. If enough people protest, Washington will have to listen. But Brennan wasn't waiting for Washington. He sent death squads after anyone who opposed him, calling them anti-insurgency patrols. 3 ranchers who'd spoken against him were found dead, their families fled or disappeared. The territorial governor, a weak man named Potts, did nothing. He was either bought or terrified, possibly both. Justice seemed impossible until unexpected help arrived. 20 Apache warriors led by the same chief who'd helped them on the trail to Washington appeared one night at their cave. We heard Crow Feather is dead, the chief said simply. He was a good man. We come to honor him. The army will call you hostiles, Caleb warned. They'll use your presence to justify more violence. Let them come. We're already condemned men. Might as well die for something worthwhile. With Apache scouts, they began documenting Brennan's crimes. Photographs of murdered families, testimonies from survivors, evidence of railroad payments to military officers. The case they built was overwhelming, but getting it to the right people seemed impossible with Brennan controlling all communication. Then Sherman's response arrived, carried by a special courier who'd ridden hard from the nearest telegraph station. Congressional inquiry approved. Senate committee arriving within the month. Hold your ground. A month, Raven Sky said quietly. Can we survive a month? They had to try. But Brennan learned about the coming inquiry and accelerated his plans. He ordered the burning of Whispering Creek's buildings, claiming they harbored disease. The cabin Caleb and Raven Sky had built the school where Apache and white children had learned together, the barn that sheltered their animals, all reduced to ash. Watching from the hills, Emma asked, "Why do they hate us, Papa?" They don't hate us. They hate what we represent. What's that change? Proof that Apache and whites can live together. That makes their excuses for theft meaningless. The burning of Whispering Creek sparked outrage even among those who'd previously stayed neutral. The image of soldiers burning a school became symbolic of federal overreach. Mrs. Morrison ensured every newspaper in the country carried the story. But Brennan had one more card to play. He announced that Caleb Mercer was dead killed while attacking soldiers. He even produced a body burned beyond recognition, claiming it was the rebellious rancher. "If you're dead, you can't testify," Hollister pointed out. "Then I'll have to prove I'm alive when it matters most." The Senate committee arrived on a train heavily guarded by federal marshals. Sherman had taken no chances with security. The hearing was scheduled for the territorial capital, with Brennan confident he'd controlled all variables. He hadn't counted on the Apache. The night before the hearing, warriors struck every military outpost between Fort Kearny and the capital, not to kill, but to disrupt. Telegraph lines cut supply wagons, destroyed horses scattered. Brennan's ability to coordinate collapsed overnight. In the chaos, Caleb, Raven, Sky, and their allies made their move. They entered the capital openly, walking into the hearing just as Brennan was explaining how he had brought peace to the territory. "Senators," Caleb announced, very much alive, "I'd like to dispute Colonel Brennan's version of events." The hearing room erupted. Brennan went for his gun but found 20 Apache warriors standing in the gallery, arrows nocked. They'd been there all along, hidden among the crowd waiting. "Order!" The committee chairman, Senator Dawes, commanded. "Colonel Brennan, explain why this man you claimed was dead is very much alive." "It's an imposter." "I can prove who I am," Caleb interrupted, showing his discharge papers, his land deed, even his wedding certificate. "Just as I can prove Colonel Brennan has been murdering civilians to steal land for the railroad." The evidence was presented systematically. Photographs, documents, testimonies from survivors. Mrs. Morrison spoke about her son's death, her dignity and grief, moving even hardened politicians. Raven Sky testified last, speaking not just of recent crimes, but of the pattern stretching back years. She named every victim she knew, Apache and white alike, making the committee confront the human cost of their policies. "This isn't about Indian removal," she concluded. "It's about greed wearing a uniform, murder wrapped in legal documents. If you allow this to continue, you're not lawmakers, you're accomplices." Brennan tried to flee during a recess, but found the building surrounded by territorial citizens who'd come to watch justice done. He was arrested by federal marshals charged with murder conspiracy and treason. But the victory felt hollow. Whispering Creek was still burned, the Apache families still on reservations, friends still dead. The committee promised investigations and reform, but promises had been broken before. "What now?" Hollister asked as they stood in the ashes of their former home. "Now we rebuild," Caleb said simply. "Brick by brick if necessary. The government won't allow it. The Apache families can't return. Then we go to them." Raven Sky had been thinking about this. "The reservation isn't far. We could build a school there, teach the children, keep our community alive, even if separated. They'll never allow whites on the reservation. They will if those whites are married to Apache." She smiled slightly. "There are several single women among the families, and I've noticed some of the ranchers who supported us are unmarried men." It wasn't the solution they'd wanted, but it was adaptation. Over the following months, a strange community developed on the reservation's edge. White ranchers who'd married Apache women, their mixed families creating a bridge between worlds. Caleb and Raven Sky built a new cabin, smaller than before, but sturdy. The school was rebuilt, serving both reservation children and those from nearby ranches. It was illegal technically, but after the congressional hearings, local authorities looked the other way. Emma grew up bilingual and bicultural, as comfortable with Apache traditions as frontier farming. Thomas became a skilled tracker taught by warriors who'd adopted him as nephew. Baby Sarah, growing fast, showed her mother's intelligence and her father's stubbornness. Boone, ancient now, but still faithful, spent his days sleeping in the sun and his nights keeping watch. The old dog had earned his rest, though he still managed to bark warnings when strangers approached. One evening, as they sat watching sunset paint the mountains, Gold Raven Sky asked, "Do you think we won?" "We survived," Caleb replied. "Sometimes that's victory enough." "Vale's dead. Brennan's in prison. The railroad stopped. That's more than survival. But the Apache are still confined to reservations. The government still takes what it wants. The killing continues elsewhere." Then others will fight as we did. We showed them it's possible. A rider approached Hollister, returning from Helena, where he'd been reinstated as prosecutor. His face carried news. "Brennan's dead," he announced. "Killed in prison. They say it was suicide, but prisoners don't usually hang themselves with Apache braiding patterns," Ravensky finished. "Justice finds a way," Caleb said quietly. "There's more. The president signed new protection orders for mixed communities like ours. Not full citizenship for the Apache, but recognition of marriage rights and property ownership for mixed families. It wasn't everything, but it was something. A crack in the wall of separation, a precedent for others to build on." That night they held a feast celebrating the small victory. Apache and white together again, their children playing without awareness of the boundaries their parents had fought to cross. During the celebration, an old Apache woman approached the same one who'd warned Caleb about Whispering Creek years ago. "The land remembers," she said cryptically. "It remembers the blood and the courage. The curse is broken, but the blessing remains." "What blessing?" "That those who fight for justice on this soil will always find allies. The land itself will support them." She smiled, her blind eyes somehow seeing everything. "Your children will continue what you started. Their children after them. The fight changes, but never ends." As she disappeared into the darkness, Caleb wondered if she'd been real or vision, but her words remained carrying truth, whether supernatural or psychological. The years that followed brought more challenges. The government's policies shifted with each administration, sometimes favorable, often hostile. But the community endured, adapted, survived. Emma became a teacher, educating both Apache and white children in defiance of segregation laws. Thomas joined the Territorial Rangers, using his position to protect rather than persecute. Sarah studied law back east, returning as the territory's first female attorney of mixed heritage. Caleb and Ravensky grew old together, their hair graying but their spirits unbowed. They became legends in the territory, the Confederate and the Apache, who'd stood against an empire and won, even if temporarily. Boone passed peacefully one winter morning, simply not waking from his sleep. They buried him on a hill overlooking both the old Whispering Creek and the new community, a guardian still watching over his people. Standing at the grave, Caleb remembered that day in Liberty's courthouse, buying cursed land for 12 cents. Every terrible thing that followed, every drop of blood, spilled, every life lost. It had all led to this, a place where Apache and white could live as equals, where children grew up without hatred, where justice occasionally prevailed. "Was it worth it?" Ravensky asked, reading his thoughts as always. "Every cent," he replied, and meant it. Every cent of those 12 pennies had bought them a lifetime of struggle, but also something more precious than peace purpose. Yet even as they stood at Boone's grave that winter morning, Caleb noticed movement in the valley below. Riders moving with military precision through the morning mist, heading directly for their community. "Company," he said quietly, and Ravensky's hand moved instinctively to the rifle that was never far from reach, even after all these years. But as the riders drew closer, Caleb recognized the lead figure. Sarah, their youngest daughter, returning from law school in Boston 6 months early. Her face, even from a distance, carried news that wouldn't wait. "Papa, Mama." She dismounted before her horse had fully stopped something she'd been taught never to do. "The Supreme Court ruled. They're dissolving all reservations. The Apache have 72 hours to relocate or be considered hostiles." The words hung in the frozen air like a death sentence. Everything they'd built, every small victory carved from hostile territory, threatened once again by distant men making decisions about lives they'd never touched. When Ravensky's voice was steady, but Caleb heard the steel beneath. "The order was signed 3 days ago. The army's already moving. They'll be here tomorrow, maybe tonight." Thomas arrived within the hour, still wearing his ranger badge, but his face grim. "It's true. Fort Ellis is mobilizing. They're calling it the final solution to the Indian problem." Final solution. Caleb tasted the words, found them bitter as wormwood. They're not even pretending anymore. Emma gathered the children, her students, Apache and white alike, while the adults convened in the old school building. The mixed families, the ones who'd built this bridge community, faced an impossible choice: abandon their Apache relatives or become outlaws themselves. "We fight," said Marcus Thompson, who'd married Joseph Crow Feather's daughter. "We've got maybe 40 men who can hold rifles." "Against the entire U.S. Army," Sarah challenged. "That's not brave, it's suicide." "Then what do you suggest lawyer girls say?" Marcus shot back. "Talk them to death with legal words." "Maybe." Sarah pulled out a leather portfolio thick with documents. "The Supreme Court ruling has a flaw. It only applies to reservation lands held in federal trust. But Whispering Creek and the surrounding properties are privately owned, legally purchased. The Apache living here aren't on reservation land, they're on private property." "You think that technicality will stop them?" Thomas asked. "No, but it might slow them down long enough for this to matter." She produced a telegram. "Justice Harlan dissented from the ruling. He's willing to hear an emergency appeal if we can get to Washington." "Washington's 2,000 miles away," someone pointed out. "The railroad made it closer. 3 days by express train. But someone has to stay and delay the army." Caleb and Raven Sky exchanged glances. Decades of marriage allowing entire conversations in a look. They both knew what had to be done. "Sarah goes to Washington," Caleb said. "Thomas organizes the evacuation to the caves. Emma takes the children deeper into the mountains. And we," he indicated himself and Raven Sky, "we make our stand." "That's insane," Thomas protested. "2 people against the army, Not 2 people, 2 symbols." Raven Sky stood, her graying hair catching the light. "The Apache woman who married a Confederate. The white man who chose Apache family over his own race. We're everything they fear, everything they want to destroy. They'll focus on us." "It's suicide," Emma said quietly. "It's sacrifice," Caleb corrected. "There's a difference." The preparations took all day. Documents were gathered for Sarah's legal challenge. Supplies were moved to the cave systems. The children were told it was an adventure, though the older ones knew better. As sunset approached, outriders appeared on the horizon. The army was early. "Go," Caleb told his children. "Now." Sarah hesitated. "Papa." "I know, little one. We know." He pulled all 3 of his children close, memorizing their faces. "Whatever happens, remember that we chose this. Every battle, every stand we chose. That's what makes us free." Raven Sky embraced each child, whispering something in Apache to them. Later they would realize it was the same blessing 2 eagles had given her the night before he died, words of protection and purpose that transcended language. As their children disappeared into the gathering darkness, Caleb and Raven Sky prepared for their last stand. They had perhaps 30 rounds of ammunition, 2 rifles, and the tactical advantage of knowing their land. It wouldn't be enough, but it didn't need to be. They just had to buy time. The army arrived with the Dawn 200 soldiers' artillery, everything needed to crush a rebellion. Leading them was a general Caleb didn't recognize, young and eager to make his reputation on Apache graves. "Caleb Mercer," the general's voice carried across the valley. "By order of the United States government, you will surrender all Apache individuals for relocation." "Come and take them," Caleb shouted back. "You're harboring enemies of the state." "I'm harboring my wife and her family on my own land. Since when is that a crime?" "Since today." The general raised his hand, preparing to signal the attack. That's when the singing started. It came from everywhere and nowhere, Apache voices raised in a death song that made the horses nervous, and the soldiers shift uneasily. The surrounding hills seemed alive with it, as if the very land was warning of bloodshed to come. "It's a trick," the general announced, though his voice wavered. "There can't be more than a handful of them." But as the sun rose higher, figures appeared on every ridgeline. Apache warriors painted for war weapons visible. Not 40 or 50, but hundreds. Warriors who shouldn't exist from tribes supposedly already relocated or destroyed. "That's impossible," the general breathed. It was impossible, but Caleb recognized the chief who'd helped them before, now leading what looked like every free Apache within 500 miles. They'd come for this last stand drawn by runners and smoke signals, by the promise of dying as warriors rather than starving on reservations. "General," his aide said nervously, "we're surrounded. We have superior weapons." His words were cut off by an explosion. The artillery position erupted in flames. Thomas and his rangers had circled behind in the night, using dynamite stolen from mining camps. Without artillery, the Army's advantage shrank considerably. The general faced a choice: engage in what would be a bloody battle with uncertain outcome, or withdraw and return with overwhelming force. Pride warred with pragmatism on his young face. "Sir," another aide arrived breathless. "Telegraph from Washington. Senate's calling emergency session about the Supreme Court ruling. We're ordered to hold position pending political resolution." The reprieve was temporary, everyone knew it. But temporary was all Sarah needed. The standoff lasted 3 days. 3 days of Apache warriors singing death songs. 3 days of soldiers growing more nervous as their supplies ran low. The Rangers kept hitting supply wagons. 3 days of Caleb and Raven Sky standing visible on their porch, symbols of defiance that couldn't be ignored. On the third night, under cover of darkness, the Apache melted away as mysteriously as they'd appeared. By dawn, only Caleb and Raven Sky remained still standing guard over empty land. The general, relieved to avoid a massacre that would stain his career, declared victory and withdrew. He'd report that the Apache had been successfully relocated, that order was restored. The lie was easier than the truth. Sarah's legal challenge reached the Supreme Court just as newspapers began carrying stories of the Montana standoff. The image of hundreds of warriors ready to die rather than surrender became a rallying cry for reformers who'd grown sick of Indian wars. Justice Harlan convinced 2 other justices to reconsider. The ruling was suspended pending review. It would take years to resolve years during which the status quo remained. The Apache families returned slowly, carefully. The community rebuilt, scarred but stronger. The government, exhausted by decades of Indian wars, began to consider alternatives to extermination. But the victory came at a cost that only revealed itself slowly. Caleb had been grazed by a bullet during the standoff, barely a scratch, he'd said. But the wound wouldn't heal. Infection set in the kind that ate a man from inside. Mountain fever, the doctor called it. Though everyone knew it was blood poisoning. He held on through winter, through spring, long enough to see Emma's first child born. A boy they named Caleb Two Eagles. Mercer, carrying both histories in his name. Long enough to see Thomas promoted to territorial marshal. Long enough to see Sarah argue her first case in territorial court and win. On a summer evening with his family gathered around, Caleb spoke his last words to Raven Sky. "Best 12 cents I ever spent." She held him as he passed her, tears falling silently on his weathered face. The man who'd survived Gettysburg, Andersonville, and countless frontier battles finally found his peace. They buried him beside Boone, overlooking the valley where so much blood had been spilled and so much hope had been born. The funeral drew hundreds, Apache and white ranchers and townsfolk, even some soldiers who'd come to respect the man they'd once been ordered to kill. The general who'd led the standoff attended, surprising everyone. "Your husband was an enemy," he told Raven Sky, "but he was an honorable enemy. In another life, we might have been friends. In another life, we wouldn't have needed to be enemies at all." With Caleb gone, many expected the community to fragment. Instead, it grew stronger. Raven Sky became its matriarch, teaching both Apache traditions and American law to any who would learn. The school expanded into an academy, drawing students from across the territory. Emma's son grew up hearing stories of his grandfather, the Confederate, who'd bought cursed land and turned it into hope. He learned to shoot from former warriors, to read from missionary teachers, to see the world through both Apache and white eyes. But the forces that had killed Caleb hadn't disappeared. They'd merely changed tactics. The railroad, blocked from direct land theft, began buying politicians instead. Laws were passed making it illegal for whites to marry natives. The mixed families were given a choice: divorce or exile. "We choose exile," Marcus Thompson said at the community meeting. "But we exile ourselves together." They moved the entire community 12 miles north, just across the territorial border, into federal land that hadn't been properly surveyed. Technically illegal, but far enough from civilization that nobody cared to enforce it. Sarah fought the anti-miscegenation laws in court, losing at every level until she reached federal circuit court. There she found an unexpected ally, Lieutenant Hollister, now Judge Hollister, appointed by a president who remembered the Montana scandals. "The law is clear," Hollister said from the bench, "but clarity doesn't equal justice. Case dismissed on technical grounds, the plaintiff lacks standing to challenge marriages performed on Indian land under tribal authority." It was a legal fiction that wouldn't hold forever, but it bought more time. Always they were buying time, hoping the world would change before their protections ran out. Thomas used his position as territorial marshal to shield the community from federal interference. When orders came to investigate, he investigated and found nothing actionable. When complaints arrived about Apache leaving designated areas, he couldn't locate any Apache to question. "You're playing a dangerous game," a federal inspector warned him. "I'm enforcing the law as I understand it," Thomas replied. "If you have better understanding, feel free to share it." The years passed like pages in a book, each one carrying stories of small victories and large defeats. The community survived the dissolution of the territories, the creation of states, the systematic destruction of native cultures. They survived by adapting, by fighting when necessary and hiding when prudent. Emma's son, young Caleb, grew into a man who carried his grandfather's name with honor. At 18, he made a decision that shocked everyone he enlisted in the army. "They're our enemy," his mother protested. "They're America's army," he replied. "And we're Americans whether they admit it or not. Change comes from within, Mama. Grandfather knew that." He served with distinction in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, the first mixed-blood soldier in his regiment. His courage under fire earned respect that transcended prejudice, at least temporarily. When he returned decorated and promoted, he used his status to protect the community. A war hero's word carried weight, even a mixed-blood hero. But Sarah saw the larger pattern. "We're always one generation from extinction," she told Raven Sky. "Every protection is temporary, every ally mortal." "Then we make ourselves indispensable," Raven Sky replied. "We become so woven into the fabric of this place that removing us would unravel everything." They began buying land through white intermediaries, accumulating thousands of acres under various names. They started businesses that employed both Apache and white workers. They made themselves economically essential to the region's survival. When World War I came, 17 young men from their community enlisted, including 2 of Thomas's sons. 3 didn't return, but those who did came back as full citizens, their service having earned what birth hadn't granted. Raven Sky lived to see it the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, making all Native Americans citizens of the country that had tried so hard to destroy them. She was 91 years old, nearly blind, but her mind remained sharp. "Is this victory?" Sarah asked her mother, reading the news aloud. "This is survival disguised as acceptance," Raven Sky replied. "But survival is its own victory." She died that winter, peaceful in her bed, surrounded by 5 generations of descendants. Her last words were in Apache, a prayer of gratitude for the life she'd lived and the lives she'd touched. They buried her beside Caleb, 2 warriors finally at rest. The funeral drew thousands by then. The story of Whispering Creek had become legend, taught in some schools as an example of American courage, and in others as a cautionary tale of government overreach. Young Caleb, now middle-aged and a full colonel, gave the eulogy. "My grandparents bought this land for 12 cents and paid for it with everything they had. But what they purchased wasn't just soil and water rights. They bought proof that different peoples could become one people, that love could conquer law, that courage could outlast bureaucracy." The community continued to grow, weathering the Depression, sending soldiers to World War II, adapting to each new challenge. The children and grandchildren of those first mixed families became teachers, lawyers, doctors, ranchers, Americans in full, even if America wasn't always full in its acceptance of them. In 1950, the abandoned site of original Whispering Creek Ranch was designated a historical landmark. The plaque read, "Here stood the home of Caleb and Raven Sky Mercer, who proved that the American dream belongs to all Americans." It was a sanitized version of history, leaving out the blood and struggle. But Sarah, now elderly herself, attended the dedication and spoke the truth. "This land was cursed with hatred and blessed with love. It was purchased with pennies and paid for with lives. It showed us the worst of what we could be and the best of what we might become." She paused, looking at the crowd of mixed faces, Apache white, and everything between. "The curse is broken. The blessing remains. May it always be so." The crowd dispersed, tourists and locals alike, most forgetting her words before they reached their cars. But some remembered. Some always remember. Today, if you drive through Montana, you might pass through what was once Whispering Creek. It's a thriving town now notable for its unusual number of mixed heritage residents and its stubborn insistence on teaching local history uncensored. In the town square stands a statue not of Caleb or Raven Sky alone, but of them standing together looking toward mountains where Apache once sang death songs and lived to sing again. The inscription reads simply 12 cents, infinite value. At the base of the statue, visitors sometimes leave pennies 12 at a time, a tribute to the couple who bought cursed land and made it sacred, who paid 12 cents and gave everything, who proved that in America, sometimes against all odds and all opposition, love and justice can prevail. The wind still sings through Whispering Creek, but it carries different songs now. Songs of children playing without knowledge of the racial lines their great-grandparents died crossing. Songs of memory and hope intertwined like Apache and European DNA in the blood of the town's children. Songs that remind us that every piece of American soil has been both cursed and blessed, and we choose daily which legacy to honor. In the town library, in a climate-controlled case, sit 12 copper pennies, the original payment for Whispering Creek Ranch. They're corroded now, barely recognizable as coins. But school children still come to see them to hear the story, to understand that sometimes the smallest payment can purchase the largest change. And sometimes late at night, when the wind is just right, locals say you can still hear it, the singing that once warned of death, but now promises life. The blessing that Raven Sky spoke of carried on mountain air, reminding all who listen that this land remembers everything. The blood and the courage, the hatred and the love, the curse that was broken, and the blessing that remains. The story of Whispering Creek never really ended. It transformed, evolved, became part of the larger American story, messy and painful and beautiful and ongoing. Every generation faces its own standoff, its own choice between surrender and resistance. And always somewhere someone remembers that once, with 12 cents and infinite courage, two people proved that America could be better than its worst impulses, that love could triumph over law, that the right stand at the right moment could change everything. The last surviving grandchild of Caleb and Raven Sky Mercer died in 2012 at the age of 93. Before she passed, she donated the family archives to the Smithsonian, thousands of documents, photographs, and letters that testified to a struggle most Americans never knew happened. Among these documents was a letter Caleb had written to Raven Sky during their trip to Washington, never sent found in his effects after his death. My dearest wife, if someone had told me that 12 cents would buy me not land but purpose, not acres but eternity, not property but the chance to matter, I would have paid 1,000 times more. You saved me from being just another bitter veteran dying slowly in a bottle. You gave me something to fight for beyond myself. The land may have been cursed, but you were its blessing, and I would buy it again at any price for the privilege of standing beside you. That letter now sits in the National Archive, filed under Documents of American Courage. School children read it and ask their teachers why anyone would buy cursed land. The wise teachers answer, because sometimes what looks like a curse is actually an opportunity to prove that blessings are stronger. And in Montana, in what was once Whispering Creek, the wind still sings through the valley. It sings of Caleb Mercer, the Confederate soldier who chose love over prejudice. It sings of Raven Sky, the Apache woman who chose hope over hatred. It sings of their children and their children's children who chose to be bridge builders in a world that wanted walls. Most of all, it sings of 12 cents that bought a revolution paid in copper, but redeemed in courage. A transaction that proved the American dream could belong to anyone brave enough to buy in, no matter the price. The curse is broken. The blessing remains. The story continues. The story continues, but not in the archives or museums where sanitized history lives. It continues in the blood of descendants who never knew that their very existence was once illegal in the soil, that still remembers every drop of blood it drank, and in one last secret that Raven Sky took to her grave. A secret that would surface 70 years after her death, when construction workers breaking ground for a new school discovered something that would change everything the world thought it knew about Whispering Creek. The foreman, Mike Harrison, great-great-grandson of the corrupt Judge Harrison, who'd tried to steal the land, stopped his bulldozer when the blade hit metal where no metal should be. What he unearthed was a strongbox sealed with wax and wrapped in oilcloth bearing Raven Sky's personal seal and a date. To be opened only when America is ready, RSM, 1924. Inside were documents that made the construction crew call first the police, then the FBI, then historians who would spend the next 3 years verifying what seemed impossible. Raven Sky had hidden proof that the curse of Whispering Creek had been real, but not supernatural. It had been chemical mercury poisoning from an illegal mining operation Barrett had run before the Apache burials, the contamination deliberately covered up to make the land seem worthless before the railroad's expansion. But more shocking were the medical records she'd kept documenting how she'd slowly treated the poisoning using traditional Apache medicine combined with techniques learned from Chinese herbalists' knowledge Sarah Chen had passed on before her murder. The cursed land had been literally toxic, and Raven Sky had spent 50 years healing it while pretending the cure was spiritual. Dr. Patricia Mercer Crow Feather, professor of Indigenous Studies at Harvard and direct descendant of both families, led the investigation. My ancestor knew that if the government discovered valuable minerals and contamination, they'd seize the land for public safety, and my people would lose everything. So she kept the secret, cleaned the land in silence, and let everyone believe in curses rather than chemistry. The discovery triggered a legal battle that reached the Supreme Court in 2016. The question if the original sale had been fraudulent, selling poisoned land without disclosure, did the descendants have claim to reparations? More importantly, did this nullify all the subsequent legal battles, making every government action against the community retroactively illegal? The lead attorney for the descendants was Michael Two Eagles, Mercer Yale Law School graduate and the first Native American to clerk for a Supreme Court Chief Justice. In oral arguments, he stood where his ancestors never could and said, 12 cents bought poisoned land that my family turned into sacred ground through sacrifice and science. The question isn't whether we deserve reparations, it's whether America can finally admit that every treaty, every sale, every legal transaction with indigenous peoples was poisoned from the start. But while lawyers argued in Washington, something else was happening in Montana. The construction site where the strongbox was found became a pilgrimage site. People left pennies always 12 and prayers. Some came seeking healing, others understanding. The phenomenon grew until the state had to post guards to manage crowds. Among those who came was James Barrett, descendant of the railroad enforcer who'd tortured Two Eagles. He'd grown up believing his ancestor was a hero of westward expansion until the documents surfaced. He arrived on a cold March morning carrying something wrapped in old leather. "This belonged to your family," he told Patricia Mercer Crow. Feather unwrapping Two Eagles' war shirt, the one he'd been wearing when Caleb found him dying on the gate. "My family kept it as a trophy. I'm returning it with shame and apologies that come a century too late." She accepted it with tears neither of them expected. "Your ancestors' sins aren't yours," she said. "You're here. That matters." The Supreme Court deliberated for 6 months. During that time, the story of Whispering Creek exploded across social media, became the subject of documentaries, inspired protests, and counter-protests. The hashtag #12cents trended globally, becoming a symbol of indigenous resistance and resilience. The decision came down 6-3, written by the first Native American justice in the court's history. The majority opinion read, in part, "The original sale of Whispering Creek Ranch was not merely fraudulent, but part of a pattern of deliberate poisoning, literal and metaphorical, that characterized American expansion. While we cannot undo history, we can acknowledge that the descendants of Caleb and Raven Sky Mercer are owed not just compensation, but recognition that their ancestors' courage revealed and healed wounds America preferred to hide." The settlement was unprecedented, $50 million to establish the Whispering Creek Foundation for Indigenous Education and Land Restoration, plus formal acknowledgement that the Mercer Crow Feather descendants held legitimate claim to thousands of acres of abandoned federal land surrounding the original ranch. But money and land weren't what mattered most. What mattered was that afternoon when Patricia stood where her ancestors had made their stand and read from a letter found in the strongbox, written by Raven Sky to descendants she'd never meet. "To those who come after, who will live in an America, we can only dream of know that the curse was never supernatural, just as the blessing was never magical. The curse was hatred and greed and poison in the ground. The blessing was love and courage and the patience to heal what seemed unhealable. Your existence proves that both curse and blessing were real, and that blessing won. Every drop of mixed blood in your veins is proof that love conquers law. Every breath you take on this land is proof that poison can be cleaned, that cursed ground can be made sacred. We bought this land for 12 cents and paid for it with our lives so you could stand here free. Stand tall. Stand proud. The ghosts of Whispering Creek are not vengeful spirits, but loving ancestors watching you live the dreams we died for. As Patricia read, observers noticed something extraordinary. Ravens began gathering, hundreds of them, circling overhead in patterns that seemed deliberate. The wind, which had been still, began to move through the valley, creating a sound that witnesses would later describe as singing not mournful, but joyful, as if the land itself was celebrating. Marcus Waters, the construction foreman who'd found the strongbox and descendant of Judge Harrison, approached Patricia afterward. "My family helped poison this land," he said simply. "I'd like to help heal it if you'll let me." Within a year, the Whispering Creek Restoration Project had become a model for environmental justice. Using Raven Sky's hidden notes and modern science, they began removing century-old contamination while preserving the ecosystem that had adapted to it. The work attracted scientists, activists, and volunteers from around the world. But not everyone celebrated. A group calling itself True Heritage America challenged the Supreme Court decision, claiming it set dangerous precedent for unlimited indigenous claims on American soil. Their leader, Senator Richard Vail, grandson of the Marcus Vail, who died at Emma's hand, led a campaign to overturn the decision through constitutional amendment. "My ancestor died defending American values against racial mixing and federal overreach," he declared at a rally. Now his killer's descendants want millions for land they stole through marriage fraud and violent resistance. The accusation triggered a national debate about American values, historical truth, and who gets to claim victimhood. Cable news ran endless panels, social media exploded with arguments, and Whispering Creek again became a battleground, this time ideological rather than physical. Young Michael. 2 eagles. Mercer, now 30, and bearing the weight of his ancestors' legacy, stood before Congress to testify against Senator Vail's amendment. Richard Vail says his ancestor died defending American values. Let me tell you how Marcus Vail died, shot by a 4-year-old girl, defending her mother from rape and murder. If those are American values, then America needs new values. My ancestors, Apache and Confederate warriors and peacemakers, all American, proved that this nation can transcend its worst impulses. Senator Vail wants to drag us backward. I believe America wants to move forward. The amendment failed, but the battle had awakened something. Across the country, similar stories emerged, communities where indigenous and settler descendants had quietly integrated lands, where historical curses masked environmental crimes, families whose very existence challenged the racial categories America had built its policies on. The Whispering Creek Foundation, led by Patricia and Michael, began documenting these stories, creating an archive of American experiences that textbooks had erased. They discovered that Caleb and Raven Sky weren't unique, just unusually well documented. Hundreds of such couples had existed, their descendants now numbered in the millions, their stories deliberately obscured to maintain racial hierarchies. On the 100th anniversary of Raven Sky's death, Whispering Creek hosted a gathering that drew 50,000 people. Descendants of all the original families, Mercer, Crow, Feather, Thompson, Morrison, even Barrett and Vail, came together. The ceremony began at dawn with Apache sunrise prayers and ended at midnight with Scottish bagpipes playing Amazing Grace, honoring all the traditions that had mingled in Montana soil. The keynote speaker was Elizabeth Morrison Crow Feather, a federal judge and descendant of both Lieutenant Morrison, who died defending the ranch, and Joseph Crow Feather, who died protecting the children. She stood where the original cabin had burned and said, "We gather on ground that has known every human emotion, love and hate, hope and despair, courage and cowardice. The soil has drunk blood, and tears has been cursed and blessed, poisoned and healed. We are living proof that America's greatest wound, the genocide of indigenous peoples, and the lies told to justify it, can heal. Not through forgetting, but through remembering. Not through separation, but through integration. Not through perpetual guilt, but through active justice. Caleb Mercer paid 12 cents for this land, but every generation since has had to buy it again with courage. Today, we make our payment." As she spoke, something extraordinary happened. The aurora borealis, almost never visible, this far south, began dancing across the Montana sky. Scientists would later explain it as an unusual solar event coinciding with specific atmospheric conditions. But those present that night saw it differently, the sky itself celebrating the covenant renewed between land and people, between past and future, between the America that was and the America that could be. The media coverage of the anniversary brought unexpected consequences. A production company announced plans for a limited series about Whispering Creek, promising to tell the true story without Hollywood's sanitization. The casting call specifically sought actors of mixed heritage, acknowledging that American stories required American faces in all their complexity. But more significantly, the Department of Interior announced a comprehensive review of all federal land transactions involving indigenous peoples between 1850 and 1924. The Whispering Creek precedent had opened a door that couldn't be closed if one poison transaction could be remedied. Why not others? Senator Vail, facing electoral defeat after his amendment's failure, made one last desperate play. He leaked documents suggesting that Raven Sky had fabricated the mercury poisoning story, that the medical records were forged, that the entire Whispering Creek narrative was an elaborate fraud perpetrated across generations. The accusation might have gained traction except for Dr. Sarah Chen Morrison, a biochemist and descendant of the murdered Sarah Chen, who'd briefly owned Whispering Creek. She'd spent 3 years analyzing soil samples from the ranch using techniques unavailable to Raven Sky. Her findings, published in Nature, confirmed not only the mercury contamination, but showed how Apache traditional medicines, particularly a specific combination of herbs documented in Raven Sky's notes, had successfully neutralized the toxins over decades. "My ancestor died for this land," Dr. Chen Morrison said at her press conference. Raven Sky Mercer spent 50 years secretly healing it. Senator Vail's ancestor profited from poisoning it. The science doesn't lie, even when senators do. Vail's credibility destroyed, he resigned in disgrace. His final statement blamed historical revisionists and racial agitators for his downfall, unable to the end to acknowledge that truth has its own power. On a crisp autumn morning, Michael Two Eagles Mercer stood in the Smithsonian's new exhibit on Whispering Creek. The centerpiece was those 12 copper pennies now displayed alongside the Constitution and Declaration of Independence as founding documents of American identity. But what drew his attention was a new addition, a video screen showing submissions from across the country, people sharing their own 12-cent stories, moments when they'd risked everything for justice and love. A young girl in Alabama told of her grandparents, Black and Cherokee, who'd built a life together despite laws forbidding their union. A man in California shared how his Japanese and Mexican grandparents had hidden their relationship during World War II, raising children who belonged to neither community in both. Story after story, proof that Whispering Creek was not unique but universal, that America had always been more mixed, more complex, more beautiful than its laws admitted. The exhibition's guest book filled with messages, but one stood out, written in shaky handwriting by a 90-year-old visitor. "My grandfather rode with Barrett. He helped burn the cabin. On his deathbed, he told me the smoke that day smelled like flowers. Raven Sky had filled her home with sacred herbs, blessing even its destruction. He never forgave himself. I came here to ask forgiveness from people long dead. Instead, I found they had already forgiven us by building the world where I could stand here ashamed but welcome." Patricia Mercer Crow Feather read that entry and wept, not from sadness, but from recognition that her ancestors' greatest victory wasn't in winning battles, but in creating space for reconciliation. The blessing Raven Sky had spoken of, that those who fought for justice on this soil would always find allies, had proven true in ways she couldn't have imagined. As the exhibition's first year ended, tallying over 1 million visitors, the Whispering Creek Foundation announced its most ambitious project, yet purchasing the original 12 acres where the cabin had stood, not to rebuild the past, but to create the future. The planned Whispering Creek Center for Restorative Justice would bring together descendants of historical enemies, indigenous and settler enslaved, and enslaver immigrant and native-born, to find healing through shared truth. The groundbreaking ceremony drew thousands, despite occurring in a blizzard that reminded everyone that Montana didn't care about human schedules. As Patricia drove the ceremonial first shovel into frozen ground, she spoke words that would be carved into the center's cornerstone. This ground has known curse and blessing poison and healing death and rebirth. We break it again not to bury the past, but to plant the future. Every person who enters here will know that America's greatest moments come not from conquest, but from courage, not from purity, but from mixing, not from forgetting, but from remembering and choosing to do better. Caleb Mercer bought this land for 12 cents. Today we reclaim it for 12 million hearts ready to heal. The crowd dispersed into the blizzard, but Michael lingered standing where his ancestors had made their stand. In his pocket were 12 pennies he'd carried them for years, a reminder of the price of justice. One by one he pressed them into the broken ground payment for another generation's installment on an endless purchase. As he placed the last penny, the wind shifted, and for a moment, just a moment, the blizzard cleared. The mountains stood revealed in terrible beauty, the same peaks Caleb had seen when he first arrived, the same slopes where Apache had sung death songs, and lived the same valleys where love had conquered law through sheer, stubborn courage. A raven landed near the pennies, studied them with intelligent eyes, then flew away carrying something small and copper in its beak. Michael laughed, remembering the old stories about ravens knowing when death was coming. But this raven flew toward the sunrise, toward tomorrow, carrying not an omen of death, but a promise of life continuing. The blizzard returned, but Michael didn't hurry to shelter. He stood on the land his ancestors had bought with blood, and pennies felt the poison they'd healed beneath his feet, heard the songs of blessing in the wind. Somewhere he knew Caleb and Raven Sky were watching, satisfied that their 12-cent investment had finally paid its full dividend, not in money, but in the mixed-blood children who would inherit America, in the healing of poisoned ground, in the proof that love could outlast law and courage could transcend curse. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter, away at college. "Dad, my American history professor says Whispering Creek never happened, that it's mythology, not history. What do I tell him?" Michael typed back, "Tell him, mythology is what we call truth. Too powerful for history books. Then invite him to Montana. Let him stand where they stood, feel what they felt. History is written by victors, but truth is written in land and blood and the stubborn survival of people who weren't supposed to exist. We exist. That's all the proof we need." As he walked back through the blizzard toward his car, Michael noticed others had followed his example. Pennies appeared everywhere in the broken ground. 12 here, 12, there 12. Everywhere payments from pilgrims who understood that some purchases are never complete, that every generation must buy its freedom again, that the price of justice is eternal vigilance and occasional courage. The Whispering Creek Center for Restorative Justice would open 3 years later its first workshop, bringing together descendants of the Sand Creek Massacre and the Colorado militia who'd perpetrated it. The second would unite families from both sides of the Wounded Knee killings. Each session began with participants placing 12 pennies in a ceremonial bowl, acknowledging that reconciliation, like freedom, must be purchased again and again with courage and humility. By then, 12 cents had become more than historical reference. It was a movement, a philosophy, a reminder that the smallest acts of courage could purchase the largest changes. Students wore 12-cent pins to protests. Couples exchanged 12 pennies instead of rings, promising to buy their love daily with courage. Veterans left 12 pennies on the graves of former enemies, purchasing peace 1 cent at a time. The movement reached beyond America. Indigenous peoples worldwide adopted the 12-cent symbol, recognizing in the Whispering Creek story their own struggles against colonization and environmental destruction. A Maori elder traveled from New Zealand to place 12 coins on Caleb and Raven Sky's graves, saying, "Your ancestors proved that the colonized and colonizer could become one people without either disappearing. That's the future we all need." But perhaps the most profound impact was on the small Montana town that had grown around Whispering Creek. Once divided between those who celebrated the story and those who denied it, the town found unity in unexpected ways. The descendants of Judge Harrison and Sheriff Cross, of the townspeople who'd called Caleb a dead man walking, and the ones who'd secretly supplied the resistance, all of them discovered that their histories were intertwined, that nobody's ancestors were purely heroic or villainous, that the blessing of Whispering Creek covered even those who'd opposed it.